Chapter 610. For a moment, Zhou Qin and the others couldn't understand why there would be other powerful magical weapons in this auction, which was supposed to be a competition for the Medicine King tripod. The appearance of the Arhat demon-subduing pagoda was like the appearance of a Chung Yao Jin. It immediately disrupted the situation on the field. Everyone began to talk about it, and for a moment, the field was like a boiling pot. Go to the internet. There was a sneer at the corner of Ziyuan's mouth. She kept looking around, as if she was looking for something. She sneered in a low voice and said, "Because someone wants to mess up the situation more than us." Zhou Qin was also an extremely smart person. She quickly reacted, widened her eyes and said, "Could it be that someone wants to deliberately consume the opponent, so they put a real powerful magical weapon up?" Ziyuan nodded slightly. She turned her face and said to Zhou Qin with a faint smile, "There is only one Medicine King tripod. That is to say, only one sect or at most two sects united together can obtain this supreme Taoist magic weapon for alchemy. It can be said that there are too many monks and too little porridge. But think about it. Those who are weaker and can't get the Medicine King tripod. If they realize that they can't get the Medicine King tripod, it seems not bad to turn around and grab another powerful magical weapon, right? At least they didn't go back empty-handed." At this time, Ao Wushuang also sneered again and again. Good means good strategy. This can not only shake the determination of many weaker cultivation sects, but also consume their funds. Hey, I just don't know who used this method. It's almost as good as Wang Jinyuan's 2 peaches and 3 soldiers. Li Yundong laughed and said, "It's just that killing 10,000 enemies and losing 3,000 soldiers. Aren't they afraid of losing their wives and soldiers?" Chris, who had been silent all this time, turned her head to look at Li Yundong, and then at Su Chan and the others. She didn't understand the situation on the field, but it was the first time she had seen such a hot atmosphere at the beginning of an auction. Not only Chris, but Sayonji Tsunekatsu and Tuki of Jinyan Tantrism were also staring at each other with their mouths agape. Tuki said, "Chongqing, what's going on?" Sayonji Tsunekatsu sneered and said, "The Chinese are crazy. These Chinese people only knew how to fight among themselves. They only knew how to cause internal strife. Humph, to actually use this kind of method. Ignore them. We only want the Medicine King tripod. These are just distractions. They are useful for those who are not determined." Tuki said anxiously, "Chongqing Jun, this is the Arhat demon subduing pagoda. This was a supreme-grade Buddhist treasure. It would have been fine if we hadn't seen it. But now that it has appeared in the auction, how could we not fight for it?" Sayonji Tsunekatsu's face was gloomy, and his eyes were fixed on the Arhat demon-subduing tower, which was shining with golden light on the auction platform. He knew that this magic weapon originated from the Wei, Jin, and Northern dynasties period in Chinese history. At that time, Emperor Liang Wu, the emperor of the Southern dynasty, believed in Buddhism and denounced Taoist cultivation sects such as Shushan as demons and evil spirits. He also gathered countless eminent monks and mages to refine this Arhat demon-subduing tower. It was said that this Arhat demon-subduing tower looked ordinary on the outside, but inside it was carved with 999 Arhats. Once this Arhat demon-subduing tower covered a demon ghost, these 999 Arhats would chant scriptures together, trap the demon, and make it impossible for him to move. It would be a lie to say that he was not tempted by such a powerful magical weapon. Sayonji Tsunekatsu gritted his teeth and hesitated for a while. He turned his head and shouted at Tuki in a low voice, "Bastard, I am young Sungjung. Listen to me. Ignore this powerful magical weapon. We only want the Medicine King tripod." Tuki Jun's face was gloomy, and he lowered his head helplessly. "Yes, Tuki Jun." At this time, the auctioneer on the stage also shouted excitedly, "Look everyone, this is the Ivory Arhat Tower. Now it has shown its spirit. 1,002,000 for one. What are you still hesitating for? 1,002,000 twice 1 million. Someone is calling a higher price 1 million 1 million. Is there a higher price?" At this time, the plans of all the cultivation sects were completely disrupted by this Arhat demon-subduing tower. As Ziyuan had expected, many of the weaker cultivation sects began to be seriously shaken. For a moment they were wavering. They didn't know whether they should grab this powerful magical weapon in front of them, or save money to grab the Medicine King tripod later. Some powerful cultivation sects also wanted to disrupt the situation on the scene. They also raised the price one after another, creating a chaotic scene of driving up the price, which made the weaker cultivation sects more and more hesitant. At this time, Chen Wansai's face was also full of doubts. He looked in the direction of Li Yundong from time to time. Xin Yu and Xin Hui, who had come with him to the auction, also tried to persuade him. Dad, don't you like this kind of evil-suppressing thing the most? Or is it blessed? Don't you want to buy it? Chen Wankai saw that Li Yundong, Su Chan, and the others had been whispering to each other. For a moment he couldn't figure out what Li Yundong was thinking, so he withdrew his gaze and said lightly, "Don't worry, let's wait and see." At this time, the price on the field had been raised to 5 million yuan. But 5 million yuan was still an unimaginably low price for such a demon-subduing Arhut tower. Li Yundong, who had been watching quietly, laughed at this time. He snorted and said in a low voice, "No wonder so many people from the cultivation sects went up to see this kind of auction just now. It turns out that they have already felt that something is wrong. Hey, we were too careless. If we had seen this powerful magical weapon earlier, we would have been more prepared." Ziyuan smiled and comforted him softly. "It's useless. They want to play tricks. Moreover, I can be sure that no one from the cultivation sects went to see these auction items in private, because they all came for the Medicine King tripod. So like us, they didn't think of checking other auction items." Li Yundong chuckled and said, "It's dark under the light. However, since someone wants to disturb the situation on the field, well, let's cooperate." Li Yundong quickly raised the sign, and the auctioneer suddenly became short of breath. He said in surprise, 10 million, buyer number 43 offered 10 million. Is there any higher price than this? 10 million once, 10 million twice. For a moment, everyone on the field looked at Li Yundong. Zhou Ping, who was sitting in the front row, looked back at Li Yundong. She frowned and said to Zhang Ling, "Master, is it Li Yundong who is playing tricks?" Zhang Ling sneered and said, "I don't know. It doesn't matter who is playing tricks. What's important is that now that things have come to this, we have to find a way to consume the opponent's funds as much as possible so." Before she could finish her words, she also raised the sign. The auctioneer suddenly took a deep breath and said in surprise, 20 million, someone has offered 20 million. He had seen a lot of auctioneers, and had seen all kinds of fierce auctions. But this was the first time he had seen an auction where the price was so high that it was multiplied by several times. This was too exaggerated. The ordinary businessmen and buyers all looked at Zhang Ling in shock and anger, wanting to see who this person was who did not play according to common sense at all. "You can't play like this. You can't raise the price like this." Rong Guofa, who had originally wanted to buy this item, was also stunned. The development of the situation was completely beyond his imagination. Although 20 million was not a large amount for him, spending 20 million to buy an ivory Arhut tower to please a beauty? This seems a little too exaggerated. But Rong Guofa was hesitating in his heart. At this time, Li Yundong once again joined in the fun and raised the price, and it was 10 million. At this time, the auctioneer was already fanatical, as if he had been injected with chicken blood. This item was completely beyond their expectations, and it had actually risen to such a high price. He shouted loudly, 30 million, is there any higher price than this? Rong Guofa was also completely shocked. He looked at Li Yundong dumbfounded and thought in his heart, this guy. Is he so rich? Could it be that he's just joking? Or is this a sky-high price game? Sometimes, in order to make huge profits, the auction house would arrange many shills to raise the price of the auction items on the scene, creating the illusion of a hot atmosphere, thus stimulating some new collectors to buy a collection that was not worth that much at all. This kind of behavior was called a sky-high price game. But Rong Guofa looked around and saw that there were all kinds of people on the scene. The most exaggerated thing was that after Li Yundong shouted the price, the people of Shaolin Temple raised their paddles again. And this monk was still unhurriedly adding 2,000 yuan. As if no matter how high the price was, he would add 2,000 yuan to it. It was as if he was a maggot attached to the bone. If this is a sky-high price game then, this method is too clever, isn't it? Rong Guofa muttered in a low voice. But soon, Li Yundong raised his paddle again, and raised the price to 40 million yuan. At this time, Zhou Qin also whispered to Li Yundong nervously, "Master, be careful. Be careful that this game of beating drums and passing flowers will stop in your hands. That will be a big loss." Li Yundong chuckled and said, "No, don't worry. Moreover, it's not a loss to buy such a powerful magical weapon for 40 million yuan. Other Taoist sects may not be able to use the powerful magical weapons of Buddhist sects when they buy them back. But for me, I don't have such worries at all." Zhou Qin smiled bitterly and said, "You're right, but what about the Medicine King tripod?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "I mean in case. We still have to fight for the Medicine King tripod." At this time, the atmosphere on the scene was full of gunpowder. Rong Guofa's girlfriend, who had come with him, saw that everyone was fighting for it, but Rong Guofa, who had been bragging to her about his wealth, was like a hesitant and frightened quail. She couldn't help but pull Rong Guofa's hand and whisper, "Hey, why don't you bid?" Rong Guofa whispered, "Are you crazy? You want to buy such an ivory Arhut tower for 40 million yuan?" His girlfriend said, "Do you think everyone here is crazy? Why are they all so eager to bid for it? Moreover, didn't you see the abnormality of this ivory Arhut tower before? It can shine. It's definitely not an ordinary item." Rong Guofa laughed angrily. "I've seen this kind of method many times. It must be the auction house's trick to please the public." As soon as he finished speaking, Su Chan, who was in front of him, giggled and turned her head. She looked at him contemptuously and snorted. Then, the little girl turned her head and whispered a few words in Li Yundong's ear. Then, she picked up the sign in his hand and held it up again. At this time, Rong Guofa only felt that all the blood in his body had rushed up with a buzz and rushed straight to the top of his head. Was there anything in this world more infuriating and irrational than being humiliated by others in front of a stunning beauty, whom he had fallen in love with? The answer was yes. He had been personally humiliated by this stunning beauty in front of other men. Su Chan didn't say a word, but Rong Guofa felt as if he had been pierced by countless sharp blades in an instant, and his whole body was covered with cuts and bruises. He suddenly remembered his behavior of showing off his wealth in front of Li Yundong. But at that time, that unknown young man was now riding on his head. What was so great about this upstart? He must be strong in appearance but weak in reality. He must be bluffing. Damn it, I want to expose his pretense. How dare you be so presumptuous in front of me? I've seen this kind of bidding many times, and I'll let you know what real bidding is. Rong Guofa was so stimulated by Su Chan's gaze that he trembled all over and instantly lost his mind. He gritted his teeth, stood up and shouted, 80 million yuan. There was a sudden uproar. I wrote too late last night and didn't finish it. I got up this morning to finish the last point and quickly send it up. This is yesterday's second update. Sorry everyone. Chapter 6:11. The auctioneer was dumbfounded. It was as if he couldn't believe his ears. An item that had a base price of 100,000 had actually been raised to 80 million. Was there something wrong with his ears? Or was this world too crazy? The cultivators of the other sects were also shocked. They looked at Rong Guo with their mouths agape. This was the first time they had seen someone raise the price from 40 million to 80 million. This was simply too exaggerated. Rong Guo's girlfriend was also frightened by his behavior. She stared at him blankly and couldn't speak for a while. She just gently pulled his sleeve. Watch nut. After Rong Guo stood up and shouted, he immediately regretted it. As the saying goes, impulsiveness is the devil. Sometimes, when people's emotions come, they really can't stop it. At this time, Zhang Ling of the Jingyi school turned her face and looked at Rong Guo coldly. She sneered at Zhou Ping in a low voice and said, Hey, just now I saw him looking at Li Yundong and the others. Now it seems humph. It's very likely that he's Li Yundong's shill. Zhou Ping also sneered and said, You want to raise the price to exhaust us? Then you should also lift it slowly. Why are you lifting it so many times? Zhang Ling chuckled. 80 million. That's not a small number. Now all the cultivation sects had to make a choice. Should they choose to let someone take away this Arhat demon-subduing tower? Should I conserve my strength? Or should I continue to follow up and eat the demon-subduing Arhat tower myself, so that I won't return empty-handed in the future? Zhou Ping also whispered. The most important thing is that Li Yundong is a Taoist cultivator who can use Buddhist powerful magical weapons. If this powerful magical weapon falls into his hands, it will definitely be like adding wings to a tiger. It would be great if we can ensure that he doesn't get his hands on this magic treasure. Zhang Ling glanced at Rong Guofeng unkindly, especially when she saw the hidden complacent smiles between Su Chan and Zhou Qin. She became more and more certain in her heart. She said, Humph, it's hard to say. However, it's better if we can spend some of their money. At this moment, she turned her head and looked in a certain direction. She nodded lightly at a plain-looking middle-aged man. The middle-aged man immediately raised the paddle in his hand. The auctioneer immediately shouted, Someone has offered a higher price. 80,002,000. Is there a higher price than this? However, Rongwu didn't raise the price again. He seemed to have used up all his strength and slowly sat down in his seat, as if he had just been in a sauna. 80 million, he had almost lost it. 80 million, as was almost. Rong Guofeng's heart was pounding, and he couldn't help being afraid. He kept wiping the sweat on his forehead with a handkerchief. As the saying goes, the first burst of energy, the second burst of energy, and the third burst of energy. For a moment, Rong Guofeng didn't want to compete with Li Yundong anymore. He still wanted to buy something. At this moment, Li Yundong and Zi Yuan looked at each other. Zi Yuan nodded slightly and said softly, This is the bottom line. Don't raise the price anymore. At this time, the game of beating the drums and passing the flowers has reached its limit. If you shout again, it is very likely that you will really fall on your head. Li Yinyang also nodded and smiled. I think so too. Although the Arhat demon-subduing tower is a powerful Buddhist magic weapon, it only has a single sealing function. In a fight, its actual effect is far inferior to the fan of 7 treasures. So I'll buy this magic weapon for 80 million yuan. At this time, the cultivators of all sects and schools seemed to have the same thought. They all stopped raising their paddles, and the real businessmen and buyers were frightened by this kind of madness. For a moment they all became spectators. No one raised their paddles again. At this time, only the auctioneer was left in the originally lively auction house. He shouted on the stage, 80,002,000 once, 80,002,000 twice. At this time, Zhou Ping said anxiously, Master, why is no one bidding? Zhang Ling smiled slightly and said to Zhou Ping, Don't worry, there will definitely be someone else bidding. As soon as she finished speaking, the auctioneer smashed down with his hammer. 80,002,000 thrice. Sold. Zhang Ling and Zhou Ping were dumbfounded. They looked at each other in dismay, and their hearts were filled with rage. Zhou Ping said in a low voice, Master, we've been tricked. We've been plotted against. Zhang Ling's original intention was not to rob this powerful magical weapon. From beginning to end, she just wanted to rob the Medicine King tripod. However, she thought that she had discovered Li Jiandong's shill, so she deliberately raised the price again, trying to consume more of Li Jiandong's funds. But she had never expected that this guy would actually give in. She had actually bought this Arhat demon-subduing tower. Although this powerful magical weapon was powerful, she couldn't use it after buying it. Bastard 80 million. Zhang Kongyan, who had been watching coldly from the side, sighed and whispered to his disciple, Zhang Lufang, with a smile, This is great. She's playing with fire. Zhang Liufang's face was full of worry. Master, do we have enough money to buy the Medicine King tripod? Zhang Ling heard their words clearly, and her face turned blue and red. She shouted angrily at Zhang Lufang in a low voice. Does our Jingyi school lack this little money? Zhang Lufang was so scared that she stuck out her tongue and lowered her head, not daring to speak. Zhang Kongyan said unhappily, Eldest Shiji, why are you shouting at the younger generation? If you have the ability, Go and shout at the one who raised the price. Zhang Ling was so angry that her whole body was trembling. She angrily turned her head and glared at Rong Guofeng, as if she wanted to remember his appearance in her heart. She gritted her teeth and sneered in her heart. Humph, well done. I'll remember this. Li Yundong saw the expressions of Zhang Ling and the others. He couldn't help laughing and said, very well, the Jingyi school has been exhausted in advance. Now they've suffered a loss. Ziyuan smiled and said, we can't be careless. The Jingyi school is rich. Li Yundong suddenly thought of something. He looked around curiously and said in a low voice, by the way, why didn't I see anyone from the Gazao sect of external alchemy? Logically speaking, the richest sect should be the Gazao sect. Why didn't Wang Jinyuan come? Doesn't he want his powerful magical weapon anymore? Zhou Qin sneered and said, Master, he could only grab one Duan Jindan and escape. Didn't he think that he would leave this Medicine King tripod behind and cause our sects to kill each other and become enemies? Li Yundong furrowed his brows. Well, it's not impossible, but… Li Yundong was about to continue when he saw Su Chan tugging at his arm with all her might. She was smiling at him, as if she was waiting for a reward. Li Yundong asked curiously, what's wrong? What are you laughing at? Su Chan laughed so hard that her nose and eyes were gone. She leaned over to Li Yundong's ear and whispered a few words. Li Yundong couldn't help laughing and quickly glanced at Rong Guofeng behind him. He reached out his hand and scratched the tip of Su Chan's nose. He whispered with a smile, it turns out that this was your idea. I was wondering why he suddenly became crazy. Good, amazing, you did a good job this time. I'll reward you well when we go home. Li Yundong's last sentence was extremely ambiguous, which made the little girl giggle. She thought of the passion they had when they had kissed before, and couldn't help but feel an itch in her heart. She wished she could be intimate with Li Yundong here and now. Li Yundong, Su Chan, and the others were talking and laughing happily. When Zhang Ling saw their relaxed and happy scene, she felt so angry that her heart was bleeding, and she sneered again and again. After the interlude of the Ivory Arhut Tower, the next few auction items were not as crazy as before. Some ordinary businessmen and buyers saw that no one was driving up the price again, so they tentatively offered a few rounds of prices, and then hastily made the final decision. After the battle, all the sects seemed to be recuperating, storing energy, and waiting for the real battle. Very quickly, all the auction items were successfully auctioned off. When the last item was taken out, everyone couldn't help but sit up straight. Their eyes lit up as they looked at a purplish-gold three-legged cauldron that was surrounded by a faint white mist. The Medicine King tripod. The auctioneer passionately introduced the appraisal and historical background of the Medicine King tripod on the stage, and invited the bidders under the stage to watch it. At this time, none of the cultivators from various sects went up to watch. Instead, some ordinary businessmen and buyers came forward to watch. When they saw the Medicine King tripod surrounded by white mist, they couldn't help sighing and nodding in praise. After looking around on the stage, Rong Guogua returned to his seat and said to his girlfriend excitedly, it's indeed a divine item, a rare treasure. This is what I want. His girlfriend also flattered him and said with a smile, that's right. Your taste is definitely right. At this time, Su Chan turned around and said with a malicious smile, give up. You can't get it. The smile on Rong Guogua's face froze. What do you mean by that? Su Chan giggled and said, nothing. You couldn't buy the ivory tower just now, let alone this one. After that, she turned her face away again. Rong Guogua was so angry that he roared in his heart. The one just now was not what I really wanted to buy. Moreover, 80 million yuan for something with a base price of 100,000 yuan. Are you crazy? This is what I want to buy. Let's see if I can buy it later. Rong Guogua was so angry that his face turned red, and his blood vessels bulged. Seeing this, his girlfriend whispered, Mr. Rong, don't care about this little girl. Before she could finish her words, Rong Guogua turned his head and roared at her in a low voice. Shut up. The woman was shocked and didn't dare to speak again. Rong Guogua stared at the Medicine King tripod with red eyes, as if he wanted to eat it in one bite. Not long after, The auctioneer began to announce the start of the bidding for the Medicine King tripod. The base price was 5 million yuan, and the lowest bid was 10,000 yuan. Rong Guogua immediately raised the sign in his hand and shouted, 10 million! The first bid was doubled. The auctioneer was shocked. He excitedly pointed the hammer in the direction of Rong Guogua and said loudly, someone offered 10 million yuan. Is there any higher bid than this? Zhang Ling turned her head and glanced at Rong Guogua. She sneered and raised the sign in her hand. 20 million. Wow, the second bid doubled again. The ordinary businessmen and buyers on the scene were dumbfounded. They had never seen such an auction. Li Yunyang and Su Chan looked at each other, and there was no longer the relaxed smile on their faces. Ziyuan said in a deep voice, the real battle of Jinyuan has begun. Although Chris was born in a big family in the United States, and often went to all kinds of high-class places, it was the first time she had seen such an auction where the price had doubled. She muttered in a low voice, it's so fierce. Although Chun Wankai didn't know what the Medicine King tripod meant to cultivators, he was also keenly aware of the strange atmosphere on the scene. He frowned and quickly calculated in his heart. His eyes kept looking in the direction of Li Yunyang. Saionji Tsunekatsu, who was sitting not far from him, saw Rong Guogua bid again, and raised the price of the Medicine King tripod to 50 million yuan. He smiled coldly and said to Tuki, it's ridiculous that the powerful magical weapon used by Sun Simiao, the king of medicine, is being bid at such a low price. Tuki, we can make our move now. Tuki nodded, raised the sign in his hand and shouted in stiff Chinese, 51 million. As soon as he finished speaking, Saionji Tsunekatsu angrily scolded him in Japanese. Bastard, don't you think you're losing face for our Jinyan tantrism by bidding like this? After that, he grabbed the sign in Tuki's hand, raised it high and shouted, 100 million! This is the first update on the 11th. Well. Chapter 612. Saionji Tsunekatsu's bid almost made Rongguo fall down. He looked at Saionji Tsunekatsu dumbfounded and said, what is this Japanese doing? Is he crazy? Is there such a bid? This, no matter how valuable this thing is, it's not worth 100 million. Shen Yu and Shen Hui, who had followed Shun Wankai to watch the fun, were also shocked by Saionji Tsunekatsu's overbearing bid. Shen Hui whispered to her father, old man, this Japanese is so fierce. Is this Medicine King tripod worth so much money? Shen Wankai narrowed his eyes and stared at Saionji Tsunekatsu. He said in a low voice, I don't know if it's worth that much. Go to the internet. But what? Shen Hui asked curiously. Shen Wankai quickly glanced at Li Yundong and said calmly, however, I will know in a moment whether this thing is worth that much money. Shen Wankai didn't expect that the price of this Medicine King tripod would soar to such a high level in an instant. The increase was so great that it was even more exaggerated than the price of a house. But for a scheming and calculating businessman like him, the most important thing now was to confirm the approximate value of this Medicine King tripod in Li Yundong's mind, and then calculate whether he should make a move or not. In the face of Saionji Tsunekatsu's crazy bid, the auction house instantly fell into a moment of dead silence. Obviously, Saionji Tsunekatsu's bid this time was like a heavy punch, heavily hitting the hearts of almost everyone on the scene, hitting their first psychological bottom line. Su Chan pulled Li Yundong's sleeve and said with a pale face, Yundong, do we need to increase the price? Li Yundong looked at Saionji Tsunekatsu as if he was facing a formidable enemy, and said with a heavy face, I don't know, but I have a very bad feeling. After all, Zhou Qin was from a big family and was experienced and knowledgeable. As soon as she saw Saionji Tsunekatsu's posture, she whispered, not good. This guy seems to be determined to win. Master, what should we do? Li Yundong quickly calculated in his mind. This time, they had raised 50 million yuan. According to Du Fei of the Chuanjian Dragon sect, they could mobilize about 90 million yuan to participate in the auction. Even if they calculated the repayment ability of the installments, the maximum amount of the two sides could not exceed 300 million yuan. Otherwise, their business would be in big trouble. However, the price had exceeded the 100 million mark in just a few bids. If it continued to grow at this rate, would he be able to compete with the Japanese? Even if he could bid for the Medicine King tripod at that time, if the bidding was too fierce, he would get into debt and think about how to get money to pay off the debt all day long. Then what was the point of cultivating? Even if the Medicine King tripod could be used for alchemy, the alchemy cycle would be too long. At that time, everyone in the Fox Zen school would definitely abandon their cultivation and be busy making money all day long. This was a matter of killing 10,000 enemies with 12,000 casualties. The losses outweighed the gains. What if the Japanese had such an idea? What could they do? Even if they didn't have this idea, the other sects would definitely be happy to see it happen. As the saying goes, it's better to cut off one finger than to injure all 10 fingers. Rather than fighting while bathed in blood, it was better to give up decisively, so as to avoid sinking into the mud pit. However, was the Medicine King tripod going to be given up just like that? Seeing that Li Yundong was hesitant, Zi Yuan advised him softly, "Li Yundong, we haven't reached our bottom line yet. We can first test how determined the Japanese's attitude is." Li Yundong had been hesitant between insisting and giving up. At this time, when Zi Yuan said this, Li Yundong immediately had an idea. He nodded to Zi Yuan and quickly raised the sign. The auctioneer had expected that the Medicine King tripod would be sold at an amazing high price, and even many of the bidders in the auction house had ambushed them. However, what he hadn't expected was that as soon as the auction of the Medicine King tripod began, the atmosphere would become white hot. He was so excited that his voice was a little out of shape. He shouted, 100 million going once. Is there any higher price than this? 100 million going twice. 130 million. Someone offered 140 million. Is there a higher price than this? When the ordinary businessmen who had wanted to bid for the Medicine King tripod heard this price, there was an uproar. It was already very exaggerated that the previous price had soared from 50 million to 100 million. They didn't expect that there would be another price increase. Moreover, the price was raised to 140 million this time. It was too fierce. It was too bloody. When Du Fei heard Li Yundong's bid, his eyes involuntarily looked at him. When his eyes met Li Yundong's, he nodded slightly to him, showing a trace of appreciation in his eyes. Du Fei was both a cultivator and an experienced businessman. He naturally knew that Li Yundong's huge increase in the price in an instant was the best response to Saionji Tsunekatsu. The auction was like a narrow path that only allowed one person to walk. As the saying goes, the brave wins when they meet on a narrow road. Saionji Tsunekatsu raised the price fiercely. On the one hand, he showed his wealth and strength. On the other hand, he deterred every bidder who wanted to bid and showed his determination to win. And Li Yundong expressed a very tough attitude to Saionji Tsunekatsu with the same astonishing amount of increase. And this attitude was very likely to make the other party think, the opponent is also very rich, and this thing is also determined to be his. At this time, the other party would either be frightened by the other party's momentum like when playing haha, or meet on a narrow road. But at this time, what would Saionji Tsunekatsu do? Saionji Tsunekatsu glanced at Li Yundong and frowned slightly. He stared at Li Yundong like lightning without blinking, as if he wanted to see through Li Yundong's heart in an instant, and see how many cards in his hand could support him. Li Yundong also looked at Saionji Tsunekatsu without showing any weakness. When their eyes met, the air seemed to spark. Although there was nothing unusual on Su Chan's face, her nervous hand tightly grasped Li Yundong's wide palm. Her body trembled slightly. She kept saying in her heart, "Don't raise the price, don't raise the price." As if he had heard Su Chan's prayer, Saionji Tsunekatsu was silent for a long time and did not speak again. At this time, the auctioneer on the stage also shouted, 140 million going once. Is there any higher price than this? 140 million. Twice. At this time, not only Su Chan, but also Zi Yuan and Zhou Qin, who had seen a lot of wind, couldn't help but be a little nervous. Their eyes were fixed on the gavel in the auctioneer's hand, and their ears were all pricked up, listening for anyone around to continue to raise the price. Just when the auctioneer shouted for the third time suddenly, a hand was raised high in the front row. and a cold voice sounded. 200 million. There was another burst of exclamation on the scene. Li Yundong and the others immediately looked at this person. Zhang Ling. Li Yundong gritted his teeth fiercely and whispered, "Damn it! Is she starting to want strength?" This time, Zhang Ling's bid completely broke through the first psychological bottom line of everyone on the scene. It was like when a long-distance run reached its limit. The runner would often struggle painfully. Do you want to persist? But when they broke through this limit, they could often continue to run smoothly. And this time, Zhang Ling's bid completely made everyone on the scene understand in an instant. The Medicine King tripod would definitely be auctioned at a bloody price. If you didn't have the strength and psychological preparation, you'd better give up as soon as possible. In an instant, many cultivation sects and some ordinary businessmen who were interested in bidding chose to give up. They changed from participants to spectators in an instant. The price of 200 million had also greatly broken through the first psychological bottom line of Li Yundong and the others. Li Yundong couldn't help but look at Du Fei of the Chuanjin Dragon sect from a distance. Both of them saw a little fear in each other's eyes. Du Fei's eyes were full of hesitation and panic, and Li Yundong's eyes were also full of unwillingness and hesitation. The situation on the field had begun to show a trend out of their expectations and control, but they could do nothing about it. At this time, the auctioneer was also trembling with excitement, and his eyes were a little red. He knew that at the end of this auction, no matter what the result was, it would set a record for domestic auctions. Although there were few cases of works of art being auctioned in domestic auctions, people in the auction industry had boldly predicted that the era of art auctions that were often auctioned would soon come. But the auctioneer didn't expect that it would be so fast, and that it would be born in his own hands. At this time, the villagers of Mount Huangshan, who were watching the auction backstage, had already fainted with excitement. He didn't expect that this thing he had seen casually could be auctioned at such a terrifying price. The auctioneer shouted in a hoarse voice, 200 million, is there any higher price than this? 200 million going once. At this time, very few people on the field were bidding, and Saionji Tsunekatsu and others were also hesitating. Although he had obtained the consent and support of Masako Tachibana before, if the price paid was too high, he would not be able to bear the consequences. But should he just give up like this? Saionji Tsunekatsu clenched his fists tightly. He gritted his teeth and shouted, 300 million! Wow! Almost everyone on the field was frightened by Saionji Tsunekatsu's madness. Even the auctioneer's heart almost beat too fast for a moment, and he fainted on the spot. Throughout the world's auction history, no one had ever raised the price by such a huge margin. This Saionji Tsunekatsu was either crazy or determined to get the Medicine King tripod. At this time, Li Yundong and Zhang Ling were frightened by the madness of Saionji Tsunekatsu. Although Jingyi School was the largest sect in the cultivation world, it almost didn't have its own large enterprises. A large part of their money depended on incense donations. It could also be said that this was consuming the savings and resources of Jingyi School. If they fought too fiercely this time, it would hurt their muscles and bones. Cultivation was the most expensive thing in this world. Dharma, money, companions, and earthly treasures. How could one cultivate without money? What's more, how could they support such a large sect? Zhang Ling looked at Saionji Tsunekatsu in shock. She knew that if they really competed with Jinyan Tantrism in terms of money, Jingyi School would definitely not win. The only one in the Chinese cultivation world that could compete with them was probably the Gazao sect of external alchemy. After all, the accumulation of Jinyan Tantrism for thousands of years was too deep, especially in Japan, where the control of the cultivation world was relatively loose. It could even be said that the Japanese cultivation world had penetrated deeply into this country. The political world of this country could be infiltrated and controlled by the forces of the underworld, let alone the cultivation world. Once the power of the cultivation world was combined with the power of the country, the great power produced was unimaginable by ordinary people. This Saionji Tsunekatsu, is he really here to rob the Medicine King tripod on behalf of Jinyan Tantrism? Zhang Ling stared at Saionji Tsunekatsu and thought quickly. Isn't he afraid that the cultivation world of China and Japan will become enemies? Or is he just scaring me? Zhou Ping gritted her teeth and said to Zhang Ling, Master, why don't we just fight with the Japanese? Zhang Ling's face was extremely ugly. She was hesitant for a moment, but the auctioneer on the stage would not wait for her. He shouted hysterically 3 times in a row. When the hammer was about to fall, Zhang Kongyan suddenly raised the sign in his hand and shouted, 350 million. Wow! Everyone was horrified. At this time, most of the people on the scene had already given up. They just looked at the scene curiously. What kind of terrible price can this Medicine King tripod sell for? When Zhang Ling heard Zhang Kongyan's bid, she suddenly turned her head, stared at him and whispered, Sure D, this is all the money we can use. Zhang Kongyan laughed and said lightly, I know. Anyway, there are only so many trump cards. It's better to push them all out at once. Zhang Ling turned her head and glared at Rong Guo with a face full of unwillingness. She thought bitterly in her heart, if it weren't for this bastard spending 80 million in advance. Humph. Many times, bidding is like riding a tiger. The later it is, the more dangerous it is. Moreover, the later it is, the more difficult it is to ride a tiger. No one is willing to admit defeat easily. Often, bidders are gambling and fighting for a bit of face. As the saying goes, people fight for a breath, and Buddha fights for a stick of incense. But no matter what, in the face of the astonishing high price of 350 million, Saionji Tsunekatsu could not calm down at this time. The body of Rigoino Tsunekatsu was trembling slightly, and Tuki, who was beside him, was pale and kept swallowing. Tuki whispered to Saionji Tsunekatsu, Lord Changsheng, you can't increase it anymore. If you increase it again, Masako Tachibana will be angry. Saionji Tsunekatsu gritted his teeth and said in a low voice, If you can't complete her task, it will not be as simple as being angry. Saionji Tsunekatsu made up his mind and shouted resolutely, 400 million. The entire arena nearly exploded. Saionji Tsunekatsu called a price 3 times in total. The first time was 100 million, the second time was 300 million, and the third time was 400 million. Such an amazing increase in price was unprecedented and frightening. Zhang Ling was instantly overwhelmed by the absolute momentum of Saionji Tsunekatsu. It was as if a sword had pierced through her heart. Her face was pale, and for a moment, she was stunned and speechless. Zhang Kongyan couldn't help shaking his head and sighing, his face full of helplessness and regret. Su Chan pinched Li Yundong's hand in horror and whispered, Yundong, it's already 400 million. This. What should we do? Li Yundong sighed and said painfully, Don't think about it. Things have completely exceeded our expectations. This is not a price we can afford. We are out. Although they had expected such a situation, the faces of Ziyuan, Zhou Qin, and the others were all gloomy and ugly. Ao Wushuang also sighed and shook her head. This is God's will. There's nothing we can do. Su Chan was shocked and said, Will the Medicine King tripod be taken away by the Japanese like this? Li Yundong watched the auctioneer on the stage repeat the current price again and again. He fixed his eyes on the auctioneer's hammer falling little by little. But just as the hammer was about to be finalized, someone on the field suddenly raised a hand. The auctioneer's hammer instantly stopped in midair. He shouted excitedly in a hoarse voice, Someone has bid a higher price. 410 million. Is there a higher price than this? Everyone on the field had thought that 400 million would be the final price, but they didn't expect that someone would raise the price again at this time. Who is this person? Why did he go crazy with Saionji Tsunekatsu? This auction had completely turned into a hand-to-hand fight between madmen. The battle of gold yuan on the field had reached its climax, and the air was filled with a terrible smell of blood. For a moment, everyone's eyes turned to look at this person. Chapter 613. Everyone looked at the person who raised the sign, only to see that this person looked ordinary. He was an old man in his 60s. This old man was wearing a bright yellow long gown and a hand-sewn fur waistcoat. Compared to the rich businessmen around him, who were dressed in suits and leather shoes, he was really not eye-catching. Go to CNET. 7K. OM. book_bar_first. In addition to the previous bidding, the old man had never raised his paddle from beginning to end, but no one had expected that the one who had gone crazy with Saionji Tsunekatsu was the guy who had never raised his paddle from beginning to end at the auction. Li Yundong suddenly looked over and was stunned. He couldn't believe his eyes and said in surprise, "Why did Mr. Shin make a move?" Zhou Qin said with both surprise and excitement, "Great, Mr. Shin made a move. I was scared to death. I thought the Medicine King tripod was going to be bought by the Japanese." Su Chan's eyes widened, and she looked at Shin Wankai in astonishment. She asked Li Yundong in a low voice, "Yundong, is Mr. Shin so rich? 400 million yuan, not 40,000 yuan." Before Li Yundong could speak, Zhou Qin laughed and said, "Su Chan, don't underestimate Shin Wankai. He is a real rich man, but he is relatively low-key, so he is not famous. You see, when he met the mayor at the opening ceremony of Desanxian, he didn't even bother to get close to him. He just greeted the secretary of the provincial party committee. Just from this style, you can see how powerful he is." Su Chan stuck out her tongue and said, "So powerful? I underestimated him. I thought he was just an ordinary rich man." Zhou Qin laughed and said, "There are many rich people in China now, and there are as many hidden rich families as there are hairs on an ox. Shin Wankai is one of them. My father used to comment on him to me. He said that he was a decisive and astute person who never fought an unprepared battle. As long as he made a move, he must be fully prepared." She stared at Shin Wankai for a while, and then looked at him. Her deep and dark eyes seemed to see through people's hearts and the world in an instant. She vaguely touched something. A smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, but she didn't say anything. At this time, all his attention was focused on Shin Wankai and Saionji Tsunekatsu, although he had become a spectator like most of the people here. Watching the Medicine King tripod fall into Shin Wankai's hands was much better than watching Sun Simiao's Taoist supreme magical weapon fall into the hands of the Japanese. Saionji Tsunekatsu did not expect that after he finally defeated Zhang Ling, a bad old man would appear out of nowhere. This was like a blood-soaked warrior who had broken through the encirclement and thought that he had become the final winner. Suddenly, a new force appeared, giving Saionji Tsunekatsu a great psychological blow and a blow to his morale. Saionji Tsunekatsu stared at Shin Wankai fiercely, as if he wanted to swallow the old man who had come out of nowhere. Tuki said in a trembling voice, "Tsunekatsu, what should we do? Give up." Saionji Tsunekatsu was trembling all over. He stared at Shin Wankai unwillingly. His sharp eyes were like a sharp blade, as if he wanted to split Shin Wankai apart, so that he could see through his true inner thoughts. Shin Wankai was indeed a person who was used to seeing great storms. He didn't even look at Saionji Tsunekatsu. He looked straight ahead with a faint smile on his face, as if he was looking down on everyone. Shin Yu and Shin Hui, who were beside him, were also shocked by Shin Wankai's sudden action. After a long time, Shin Hui said, "Old man, are you okay? 400 million. 400 million to buy such a thing?" Shin Yu was also shocked. "Dad, are you crazy?" Shin Wankai looked at them with great displeasure and shouted in a low voice, "Shut up! What do you know?" Saionji Tsunekatsu saw that both Shin Yu and Shin Hui were questioning Shin Wankai. He thought to himself, "Is this old guy bluffing? In fact, he has also reached his limit." Saionji Tsunekatsu quickly calculated in his heart, "Although Masako Tachibana didn't set a bottom line for me, as far as I know, the bottom line in her mind should be about 500 million. But if it exceeds 400 million, she will definitely be angry. The current price is 410 million, which will already make Masako Tachibana very angry, but if it costs 500 million to complete the task, it is not unacceptable." Saionji Tsunekatsu hesitated, and almost everyone on the scene saw the clue. Zhou Qin whispered in Li Jiandong's ear, "This Japanese is a little scared. Now the price should be closer to the limit he can bear, so he can no longer raise the price unscrupulously. In a moment, when we see what price he offers, we should guess his bottom line." Saionji Tsunekatsu thought for a moment. When he saw that the hammer in the auctioneer's hand was about to fall, he suddenly showed a grim smile, raised the sign and shouted, 500 million! F*ck. Almost half of the people on the scene stood up and looked at Saionji Tsunekatsu in astonishment. Tuki was so frightened by Saionji Tsunekatsu's action that he almost fell off his seat. He looked at Saionji Tsunekatsu with a pale face, and his lips trembled slightly. He shouted in his heart, "Tsunekatsu is crazy, he must be crazy. When we go back, we will be locked in the ghost prison by Masako Tachibana. It must be. No, I must stop him." Tuki was about to speak, but he saw that although Saionji Tsunekatsu's face was full of a desperate, ferocious smile, his hands hidden behind his back were trembling slightly. Seeing this scene, Tuki swallowed the words that were on the tip of his tongue. Zhou Qin was also shocked and speechless. She couldn't speak for a long time. At this time, Li Jiandong laughed and whispered, "As the saying goes, fighting is like using troops, and the business world is like a battlefield. This Japanese guy is good at psychological warfare. I know what you just said, but even I know it, how can he not know it? So, he simply unsheathed his sword and fought with you to the death." At this time, everyone on the scene was seriously shaken by their previous judgment. Has this little Japanese guy not reached the bottom line at all? Or is he bluffing now? At this time, Li Jiandong had completely let go of the obsession of competing for the Medicine King tripod, jumped out of this circle of interests, and looked at this fierce battle from the perspective of a third party. He recalled the situation of all parties bidding at the auction before, and he seemed to understand something. He couldn't help but whisper, "There is a saying in the art of war that the false is the real, and the real is the false. I think that now this little Japanese is really at the end of his rope." Su Chan asked in confusion, "Yundong, what do you mean? Why do I feel that this Japanese guy seems to have a lot of money? You see, he increased the price by nearly 100 million yuan again. It's scary," Li Jiandong said with a smile. Before, Saionji Tsunekatsu raised the price several times in order to scare off his competitors, especially his opponents who raised the price by a lot. But Shin Wankai is different. He was the last one to appear, and the increase was much smaller than in the previous rounds. If Saionji Tsunekatsu really has the confidence, he can follow Shin Wankai's example and increase the price by 10 million yuan, and then grind with his opponent all the way to see who can grind to death. Hey, but this Saionji Tsunekatsu knows very well that cutting flesh with a blunt knife is the most painful, so he decided to break his wrist. It's better to break one finger than to hurt 10 fingers. Therefore, the purpose of his fourth large increase in price is to completely defeat his opponent with the momentum of a tiger that can swallow thousands of miles. At this time, Zhou Qin couldn't help but look at Li Jiandong with admiration and said with a smile, "Master, you are right. If you go to do business, you will definitely be successful." If Saionji Tsunekatsu's move was used on a newcomer, it was very likely to have an effect. But Shin Wankai is different. He is an old fox who has been in the business world for a lifetime. How could he fall into such a trap? As if to confirm Zhou Qin's words, Shin Wankai's expression remained unchanged. He slowly raised the sign in his hand, and once again increased the price by 10 million yuan. The price of the Medicine King tripod had become a terrifying 510 million yuan. At this time, Saionji Tsunekatsu's face couldn't help but change dramatically. At this time, he also suddenly came to his senses. He knew that his opponent was a very cunning old fox. Not only was he cunning, but he was also experienced. This move of his was useless against the opponent. But at this time, he had already called the limit price. What should he do? Saionji Tsunekatsu's whole body trembled uncontrollably. He gritted his teeth. When the auctioneer repeated the price again and again, he suddenly roared, 520 million yuan. At this time, there was another burst of sigh. Unlike the previous sigh, at this time, everyone heard Saionji Tsunekatsu's fierce appearance but weak heart. They all noticed that the Japanese was on the verge of collapse. At this time, the eyes of the audience involuntarily turned to Shin Wankai, wondering in their hearts, is this old man also on the verge of collapse? Is he just not showing it? Although the increase of the price had been reduced at this time, the atmosphere on the scene became more and more tense. Su Chan held Li Yundong's hand tightly and whispered nervously, "Yundong, this Japanese also raised the price slightly. Is he going to fight a war of attrition with Mr. Shen?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "It should be like this. However, I don't know where Mr. Shen's bottom line is. So I don't know who will win if the two of them continue to consume each other. But in terms of momentum and psychological advantage, Mr. Shen has already taken the advantage." As soon as Li Yundong's voice fell, Shen Wankai slowly raised the sign and raised the price by 10 million yuan again. At this time, Saionji Tsunekatsu was completely like a red-eyed gambler. He immediately roared, 540 million yuan. Shen Wankai was not in a hurry to bid immediately. He waited until the auctioneer called for the third time, before he slowly raised the sign again. 550 million yuan. Saionji Tsunekatsu immediately roared again, 560 million yuan. After a while, Shen Wankai raised the sign again and said, 570 million yuan. The two of them raised the price back and forth like a barrage of cannons. Although the range was not as terrifying as before, such a blunt knife cutting flesh was really torturous. The price was approaching the 600 million yuan mark. The price of 600 million yuan meant that it was also an astonishing price in the international market, not to mention in the domestic market. At this time, everyone on the scene held their breath and did not dare to breathe more. Besides Saionji Tsunekatsu, Tuki trembled and grabbed Saionji Tsunekatsu's arm. He couldn't help but shout in Japanese, "Mr. Tsunekatsu, you can't increase it anymore. You really can't increase it anymore." Saionji Tsunekatsu turned his head and roared in Japanese with a ferocious face, "Bastard, shut up!" After that, his face twisted like a devil and he roared, 600 million yuan. Everyone present took a deep breath and looked at Shen Wankai in unison. Li Yundong's expression was also a little solemn. He said in a low voice, "This should be the last desperate attack of the Japanese." Ziyuan shook her head and said, "Not necessarily. The Japanese are famous for their tenacity. Their ability to resist pressure and tenacity can be called the first in the world. If Shen Wankai still follows the price of 10 million yuan, maybe it will continue to be consumed." Li Yundong nodded and said, "What you said makes sense. Let's see how Mr. Shen will bid." But at this time, Shen Wankai turned his face for the first time and looked at his opponent who was fighting with him on the battlefield. He frowned and pondered, not speaking for a while. The auctioneer on the auction stage saw that Shen Wankai had not spoken for a long time. After he kept repeating the price, he also thought that 600 million yuan should be the final price. After he quickly repeated it for the third time, he breathed a sigh of relief and raised the gavel in his hand high. At this time, Saionji Tsunekatsu also seemed to collapse. He showed a smile of victory in a battle to the death and laughed proudly. "Ah, Mr. Shen gave up?" Su Chan saw the gavel fall little by little, and she cried out in surprise. But at this critical moment, Shen Wankai suddenly smiled. He raised the sign in his hand and slowly said, 700 million. Chapter 614. Just when Saionji Tsunekatsu thought he had won, Shen Wankai suddenly made the most fatal blow. Go to the net. 7K. OM. At this moment, Li suddenly remembered the Pacific War between the United States and Japan, from Pearl Island to Midway Island during World War II. Although all the discerning people knew that Japan would be defeated at the beginning, Japan had been retreating all the way from Midway Island, but they had been resisting all the way, like cornered beasts fighting, and launched a fierce bloody battle. Even the Emperor of Japan and the crazy army headquarters were ready to mobilize the whole country to fight the landing of the Americans. But at this time, the Americans knew that they would suffer heavy losses if they landed in Japan. So they gave the Japanese the most terrible blow, atomic bombing. Although the number of people killed by the 2 atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was far less than the number of Japanese soldiers killed on the battlefield, when the Japanese were ready to fight the final war of attrition with the other side, the Americans suddenly gave them the most unimaginable blow. As the saying goes, the market is the battlefield, and fighting is like using troops. Shen Wankai had been fighting hand-to-hand with Saionji Tsunekatsu, but at the last moment, When Saionji Tsunekatsu thought he had won, he suddenly threw the atomic bomb. This sudden huge increase in price finally broke the will of Saionji Tsunekatsu and completely destroyed his idea of winning. 700 million. This was an auction price that could shock the world. Wow! Almost everyone on the scene exclaimed. Saionji Tsunekatsu's laughter suddenly stopped. It was as if someone had hollowed out his chest. His body shook, his face became pale, and he stayed where he was as if he had lost his soul. The auctioneer was also stimulated by this price, and almost had a heart attack again. He shouted in a hoarse voice, 700 million! Is there a higher price than this? 700 million once. 700 million twice. 700 million thrice. Sold. The mallet finally landed heavily. Everyone let out a long sigh of relief. They couldn't help but shake their heads and sigh with emotion. My God, 700 million! What kind of concept was this? It was about to refresh the world auction price. The auctioneer's face was flushed, and his heart was thumping wildly. He knew that no matter what the outcome was, their Tianai auction house would become famous throughout the world. Shin Hui and Shin Yu sat beside Shin Wangkai in a daze. They stared blankly at their father without any joy of victory. Instead, they looked at Shin Wangkai with an inexplicable blank gaze, as if they didn't know this person at all. Saionji Tsunekatsu stood there like a dead man. Tuki, who was beside him, looked as if he had lost his parents. He smiled bitterly and said to Saionji Tsunekatsu, Mr. Tsunekatsu, we failed. Forget it, let's go back. Saionji Tsunekatsu didn't seem to hear it. His eyes were fixed on Shin Wangkai. In his eyes, after Shin Wangkai succeeded in the auction, he did not have a sense of victory and joy. Instead, he frowned slightly, as if there was something unhappy. Saionji Tsunekatsu couldn't help but think, is he also close to his limit? Or if he persisted a little longer, would he give up? Thinking of this, Saionji Tsunekatsu could not help but grit his teeth and walked toward Shin Wangkai. When Tuki saw this, he quickly grabbed him and whispered in Japanese, Mr. Tsunekatsu, calm down. What are you going to do? Saionji Tsunekatsu didn't even look at him. He pushed him away and walked straight to Shin Wangkai, staring at him with gloomy and terrifying eyes. Seeing this, Shin Yu stood up and shouted, What do you want? Saionji Tsunekatsu turned his head and glared at him. Shin Yu suddenly felt as if his heart had been stabbed by a knife. He fell into his seat and trembled all over. Shen Hui stood up at this time and said angrily, Do you want to hit someone after losing? At this time, Li Yundong and the others also came over. Li Yundong smiled slightly and said, Saionji Tsunekatsu, look at where you are standing under your feet. This is China, not Japan. After he finished speaking, Du Fei of the Chuanjin Dragon sect also stood up with a smile. Sun Wei Qing, who was beside him, also stood up and stared at him unkindly. Then, the cultivators of all the sects on the field all stood up with a common enemy and stared at Saionji Tsunekatsu. The fierceness on Saionji Tsunekatsu's face suddenly dissipated a lot. He took a deep breath, bowed respectfully to Shin Wangkai, and said, I would like to ask your name. Shin Wangkai nodded gratefully to Li Yundong and the others. He smiled slightly and said, Shin Wangkai. Saionji Tsunekatsu looked respectful and said, Shin Jun, may I ask why you have to compete with me for this Medicine King tripod? Shin Wangkai smiled slightly and said, Because anyone can take this Medicine King tripod, but you Japanese can't. This sentence immediately caused the whole audience to cheer loudly. For a time, the applause on the field was like thunder, and there were bursts of cheers. At this time, Saionji Tsunekatsu bent down, and a fierce look flashed in his eyes. But when he raised his body, his face was humble. He said, So that's how it is. Congratulations on getting this Medicine King tripod. At this time, Li Yundong also whispered to Su Chan, I haven't seen it yet. This Mr. Shun is very patriotic. Is he also a nationalistic youth? Su Chan pursed her lips and said with a smile, He is not young. Li Yundong laughed and said, He has a young heart. He is a young man. Zi Yuan, who was at the side, heard their conversation and smiled slightly. She gave Shen Wangkai a meaningful look and smiled without saying a word. At this time Rong Guofa was quite gloating. Although he didn't bid for this Medicine King tripod. What made him happy was that Li Yundong didn't get it either. It doesn't matter if I don't live well. But I'm happy to see that you don't live well either. Rong Guofa was in such a state of mind at this time. Rong Guofa hugged his girlfriend and said with a smile, "Do you see? Mr. Shen is the real rich man. What is momentum? What is domineering? He's different from some young nouveau riche." Hearing his words, Su Chan turned her face unhappily and said, "What are you talking about?" Rong Guofa raised his head and laughed. "I didn't say anything. It's just that I heard some people boast before. But now they return empty-handed. At least I bought an ivory Arhat tower. It's much better than some people empty-handed, isn't it?" Su Chan was furious. Just as she was about to quarrel with him, Li Yundong stopped her and said to her with a smile, "Chan, or don't tell him. It's meaningless." Seeing that Li Yundong had backed down, Rong Guofa thought that he was afraid to fight. He suddenly felt a sense of exaltation. He sneered and said, "Young man, learn more. You are still young." Li Yundong smiled slightly and didn't say anything. Seeing that Li Yundong had backed down again, Rong Guofa was quite unforgiving. He wanted to continue to taunt him, but he saw Shen Wankai walking straight over at this time. He immediately greeted him with a smile and stretched out his hands. "Old Shen, you have fought for our Chinese people today." Shen Wankai saw him at a glance and shook hands with him with a smile. He smiled noncommittally and said, "Don't mention it. It's just a child's game." Rong Guofa flattered with a smile on his face. "Mr. Shen is so domineering. You actually regard the astronomical price of 700 million as a child's game. Amazing. No wonder you are the overlord of the South." As he spoke, he turned his head again and glanced at Li Yundong intentionally or unintentionally with a sarcastic smile on his face. Seeing this, Su Chan was so angry that her cheeks puffed up. Just as she was about to lose her temper, she saw Shen Wankai nodding to her with a smile. "Miss Su Chan, we meet again." Su Chan had to swallow the words that rushed to her mouth. She stretched out her hand gracefully and shook hands with Shen Wankai, saying, "Mr. Shen, congratulations." Shen Wankai smiled slightly. He turned his face to look at Li Yundong and said, "Childly, I have a presumptuous request. Please agree." Before Li Yundong could speak, Rong Guofa was stunned for a moment. He looked at Li Yundong incredulously and thought to himself, "Who on earth is this guy? Why is Mr. Shen so polite to him?" Li Yundong laughed and said, "Mr. Shen, just say it. Just because of what you said just now, I will also." Before Li Yundong could finish his words, he heard Zi Yuan whispering to him in private, "Li Yundong, don't be in a hurry to agree to him." Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat, but he changed his words and said, "Just because of what you said just now, I will also think about it." Shen Wankai didn't doubt him and laughed. He turned around and walked to the auction platform. After saying a few words in private with the auctioneer suddenly looked shocked and asked Shen Wankai carefully several times in disbelief. It was not until Shen Wankai was a little impatient that he picked up the microphone, coughed dryly, and said to everyone present, "Ladies and gentlemen, now I want to announce something amazing. Mr. Shen Wankai, who has just bid for the Medicine King tripod at a sky-high price of 700 million yuan, has decided to give such a sky-high treasure to Mr. Li Yundong. Let's witness all of this together." As soon as the auctioneer's voice fell, there was an uproar. Almost everyone in the cultivation sects was stunned. What? Zhang Ling could hardly believe her ears. 700 million yuan. Just like that. Zhou Ping was tongue-tied and dumbfounded. Li Yundong himself was also stunned, but he quickly reacted and looked at Zi Yuan. When their eyes met, Zi Yuan nodded slightly to him. Li Yundong immediately sneered and thought to himself, "This Shen Wankai is really good at playing tricks. I told him before that spending a lot of money is good for cultivation, and now he has done such a thing. I have no choice but to accept him as a disciple. Hey, what a good trick." Su Chan and Zhou Qin were not fools. They quickly reacted and looked at Li Yundong with worry in their eyes. They all knew Li Yundong's character very well. He could be persuaded but not cowed. He was frank and straightforward in his words and deeds. He liked to be straightforward and didn't like to beat around the bush. Shen Wansai's way of beating around the bush was not small. Although it could be said that he had put in a lot of effort, it just happened to violate Li Yundong's taboo. If he wanted to take credit for this matter, and wanted to be apprenticed, then Shen Wankai would have made a wrong calculation. Rong Guofa didn't know about the twists and turns. He stared at Li Yundong as if he had seen an alien and stammered, "You, who are you?" Hearing his words, Su Chan turned her head and said very seriously, "Don't you remember what I once said to you? Remember, his name is Li Yundong. I once said that in less than 2 years, he would definitely become a famous figure in the world, and you will never be able to compare with him." After that, Su Chan snorted and turned her face away, her face full of pride. At this time Tuki, who was not far away, whispered to Saionji Tsunekatsu, "Changsheng, what should we do now? This Medicine King tripod has fallen into the hands of Li Yundong." Saionji Tsunekatsu turned his face and stared at Shen Wankai, who was holding the Medicine King tripod with both hands and calmly taking pictures in front of the cameras of the media. He sneered and said, "Since we can't bid for it, it seems that this matter can't be good. We can only use force. Tuki, get ready. I'm going to steal the Medicine King tripod, under the eyes of the Chinese cultivators." Chapter 6:15. When Tuki heard Saionji Tsunekatsu's words, he was shocked. He said in surprise, "Changsheng, are you crazy? There are several Jinshin masters here." Saionji Tsunekatsu smiled coldly and said, "When the enemy thinks they have won, it is the beginning of their failure. Do you think I don't know that there are Jinshin masters here? In a while, you will use the Shikigami to make a little noise nearby. As long as there is chaos, the auction house will definitely immediately put away all these auction items, and the cultivators here should not be allowed to follow them in. Go to the internet. 7K. OM. As long as this Medicine King tripod can get out of the sight of these cultivators, I have a way to get it away." Tuki was stunned for a moment. He said worriedly, "But Changsheng, if you do this, will it cause mutual hatred and confrontation between the Chinese and Japanese cultivators?" Saionji Tsunekatsu turned his face ferocious. He stared at Tuki coldly, suppressed his anger, and growled in a low voice, "Tuki, come with me." Tuki was frightened by Saionji Tsunekatsu's appearance and took a step back, but he quickly lowered his head and whispered, "Yes, Changsheng." Saionji Tsunekatsu took Tuki to a bathroom. After he was sure that there was no one inside, he suddenly turned around, holding a vajra in one hand and a mantra finger in the other, and pushed it in front of Tuki. Tuki was about 1.75 meters tall, and he was not thin. But when he was pushed in the air by Saionji Tsunekatsu, his whole body suddenly flew up and hit the wall behind him. The tile wall was dented, and for a moment, the white tiles fell down. Saionji Tsunekatsu roared angrily, "You idiot! Since Li Yundong defeated Miss Tachibana Wakako, the two sides have been enemies. Now Masako Tachibana has been forced into a corner by the other sects of the New Meaning School and the Ancient Meaning School. She must defeat Li Yundong in public to save her face. Otherwise, we will kneel down in the hands of those idiots who changed the doctrine." Tuki felt as though he was being pressed against the wall by an invisible hand. He was in so much pain that he could not speak. He could only speak intermittently. I understand. Lord Changsheng, quickly let me go. I will do as you say." Saionji Tsunekatsu retracted his hand slightly, and the anger on his face dissipated slightly. He snorted coldly and said, "If you know, hurry up and do it outside. Make some noise." As soon as Saionji Tsunekatsu finished speaking, he frowned and waved his fingers. The door of the bathroom closed automatically with a bang. Coincidentally, a man was rushing to the washroom, but he couldn't open the door no matter how hard he tried. Saionji Tsunekatsu stared at the door for a while. When he saw that the people who tried to enter the door had left and stopped trying to open the door, he turned his face and stared at Tuki. Tuki rubbed his chest. He did not dare to be negligent. He quickly took out a few talismans from his pocket. One hand was pinching his fingers, and the other hand was holding the talismans with his index and middle fingers. He put them across his chest and recited a spell in a low voice. As soon as he recited the spell, the two talismans burned with a bang. Black smoke came out of the talismans and drilled out through the crack in the door of the washroom. Just as Sayonji, Tsunekatsu and Tuki were hiding in the washroom and plotting, Shinyu surrounded Shun Wankai like a fly and said, "Dad, the company doesn't have much liquidity now. Where can we get 700 million yuan? Dad, 700 million yuan to buy such a thing? It's okay if you buy it yourself. Why did you give it to this? To an outsider? Dad, I'm talking to you. Please, I'm your son, your only son. Can you take a look at me? I also have a share of the property of this family. You can't mess around like this, can you?" Shinyu's last words stimulated Shun Wankai. He reluctantly smiled at the people who came to congratulate him and compliment him. Then he turned around and pulled Shinyu to a deserted corner with a normal face. His face suddenly changed. He gritted his teeth and said angrily, "You know, everything in this family is made by me, Shun Wankai, alone. Without me, there would be no you in this world. Without me, you would not have the luxury you have now. Don't think you're great just because you've done a few business worth millions. Let me tell you, without me you're nothing. If it weren't for my face, for the sake of the country I fought for with my own hands, would they cooperate with an idiot like you?" Shun Wankai mercilessly scolded his son, who hated iron for not becoming steel. He gnashed his teeth and said, "Do you think your wings are hard now? How dare you talk to me like this? Let me tell you, even if I lose all my property one day, I won't leave you a penny. When you start from scratch and lay down such a large foundation as mine, you can tell me that you also have a share of the property of this family." Shinyu was stunned by Shun Wansai's scolding. For a moment, he was stunned on the spot and couldn't come back to his senses. In his mind, he really couldn't understand why his father would rather spend 700 million yuan to buy an inexplicable Medicine King tripod than leave a penny for him. Why was his father willing to give the 700 million yuan item to an outsider instead of giving more money to his own son? Wasn't he his own son? Shinyu trembled all over and looked at his father in disbelief, as if he were looking at a stranger. He couldn't help but take a few steps back. Suddenly, he turned around and looked at Li Jiandong fiercely. Seeing this, Shun Wankai immediately shouted, "If you dare to act recklessly, I will immediately break off the relationship between father and son." Shinyu's whole body shook violently. He looked back at Shun Wankai in despair. The corner of his mouth twitched, revealing a bitter smile. He laughed, turned around, and rushed out of the auction hall while laughing. Shun Wansai's eyes were fixed on Shinyu's figure, and his whole body was trembling slightly. At this time, Shun Hui also came over and said cautiously, "Old master, don't be angry with my brother. Shun Wankai said in a tired and low voice, "Don't mention him, if you still have a little filial piety." Shun Hui obediently closed her mouth and didn't say anything. Shun Wankai seemed to have aged dozens of years in an instant. His face was haggard and wrinkled. He covered his chest, his face full of pain, and his body fell back little by little. Seeing this, Shun Hui immediately held him up and shouted, "Help, help." As soon as Shun Hui's voice fell, she heard a calm and magnetic voice next to her. "Don't worry, let me see." Shun Hui turned her head and saw Li Jiandong holding Shun Wansai's hand and talking to her calmly. She knew that Li Jiandong was a strange man with divine skills. In addition, he had once saved Shun Wansai's life, so she didn't dare to show her temper in front of Li Jiandong. Shun Hui asked anxiously, "How is the old man?" As Li Jiandong slowly transferred his jinqi to Shun Wankai, he said in a low voice, "Mr. Shun is fine. He's just angry, and his qi and blood are not enough." Shun Hui asked in confusion, "But after you saved the old man last time, wasn't he very good? I think he was more than 10 years younger at that time. Why did he suddenly become like this?" Li Jiandong sighed softly and said, "Mr. Shun is now in a declining body. All parts of his body and organs are relatively weak. If he goes down, it will be the stage of failure and death. At this stage, people can rely on elixirs to protect themselves for a while, but it is unlikely that one pill can make him return to his youth, let alone completely change his physique." Shun Hui looked at Li Jiandong without understanding. She remembered the magic of this boy, and then remembered that her father had spent a lot of money to buy the Medicine King tripod. and then wanted to give it to the boy in front of her. Suddenly, her heart moved, as if she had understood something, and there were a few clear lights in her eyes. Li Jiandong's Junqi was pure and vigorous. After only a while, Shen Wancai's complexion was obviously better. He let out a long breath, smiled at Li Jiandong gratefully and said, "Child Li, you saved my life again. I really don't know how to thank you." Li Jiandong smiled slightly and said, "It's nothing. You don't have to thank me. What's more, Mr. Shen took back the Medicine King tripod from the Japanese. I should be the one to thank." Shen Wancai held Li Jiandong's hand tightly and asked nervously, "Child Li, you haven't answered my presumptuous request just now." Li Jiandong thought for a while, sighed softly and said, "Mr. Shen, your gift is too expensive. I can't accept it." Shen Wancai had experienced many vicissitudes of life, and had rich experience. When he saw Li Jiandong's hesitation, he immediately understood. He sighed and said bitterly, "Child Li, you saw it just now. I only have one son. I expected him to become a talent, and inherit my family business in the future. But I didn't expect. Alas, I can't help him." At this time, Shen Wancai also seemed to have put aside the knot in his heart. Regardless of the presence of Shen Hui, he said to Li Jiandong sincerely, "Child Li, I know that you must not be immortal. I also know that if I do this, you will definitely be unhappy in your heart. But I really have no choice. My only son is so useless. In the future, if the family business is handed over to him, how can I rest assured? I am already half a body in the ground. In the past, the only hope was that this son could become a talent, but now the only hope I have is that you, Child Li, can teach me the magic of immortals. Even if I can't live forever, I can at least live a few more years. Is such a request too much?" When Shen Wancai spoke of his sadness, not only were his eyes full of tears, but Shen Hui also looked sad. She whispered comforting words to Shen Wancai while crying. Li Jiandong originally had a lot of unhappiness in his heart, but at this time, he couldn't help but dissipate a lot. He sighed softly, smiled slightly and said, "I understand. Let me think about it for 2 days, okay? 2 days later, I will definitely give you an answer." There was a hopeful look in Shen Wancai's eyes. He straightened his body slightly and said in a trembling voice, "Child Li, I'll wait for your news." Li Jiandong smiled, and was about to speak when he suddenly heard a loud bang coming from not far away, followed by a sharp scream. "Murder, murder!" At this time, some of the cultivators who had not left the auction house looked in the direction of the sound in surprise. Su Chan curiously approached Li Jiandong and whispered, "Who is tired of living and making trouble here?" As she said this, the little girl raised her head and blinked her eyes. "Yindong, do you want to go and see what's going on?" Li Jiandong smiled slightly. "Okay." Just as he was about to continue speaking, he saw that the people of the auction house were all nervous. They asked the security guards to escort the Medicine King tripod to the backstage. At the same time, they shouted at Shen Wancai to let him go with them. Shen Wancai said to Li Jiandong, "Child Li, why don't you go with me?" Li Jiandong looked around, and saw that the cultivators of all sects were looking at him intentionally or unintentionally. He knew that he was already in the teeth of the storm at this time, so he didn't want to be so ostentatious, so he said, "No, if you are worried about safety, let Zi Yuan and Zhou Qin accompany you. With them here it will be fine." At this time, Ao Wushuang also said, "Leader, you go. I'll help you keep an eye on it." "It will be fine." Li Jiandong originally wanted Ao Wushuang to stay as well. At this time, seeing that she had taken the initiative to volunteer, he was immediately overjoyed and said, "That's great. With Senior Ao Wushuang, I can rest assured." Chapter 616. Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, and Ao Wushuang accompanied Shen Wancai to the inner hall of the auction house. Just as they were about to enter, the head of security of the auction house stopped Zi Yuan and the others. After looking Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, and Ao Wushuang up and down, his eyes flashed with amazement. He turned to Shen Wancai and asked, "May I ask who they are?" "Mr. Shen, only you can go in with us. Let's go." Although Shen Wankai didn't know who Ao Wushuang was, nor did he know what kind of ability Zhou Qin, the daughter of a noble family, had, he knew Zi Yuan's ability. Moreover, Li Jiandong valued Ao Wushuang so much that he had to speak up to protect her. He smiled and said, "They are my protectors. Let them go in with us." The person in charge sneered in his heart and thought to himself, "Do you think you are Gaddafi? Get a large group of beautiful bodyguards? I think they are your mistresses, right?" He shook his head and said, "No, Mr. Shen. Only you can go in alone." Shen Wankai frowned secretly and looked a little unhappy. Just as he was about to speak, Zhou Qin asked, "The Medicine King tripod is such an important thing. If it is lost or robbed, can you bear the responsibility?" The person in charge sneered and said, "Do you know what we used to do? If we can't control it, can you?" Zhou Qin raised her eyebrows. Just as she was about to lose her temper, she suddenly heard a loud bang coming from the inner hall, followed by a few screams. The face of the head of security suddenly changed. He couldn't care less about Zhou Qin and the others. He turned around and rushed to the inner hall behind him. Zi Yuan and Zhou Qin looked at each other and quickly followed him in. As soon as the two of them rushed into the inner hall, they found several uniformed security guards sitting limply in the corner of the wall. It was unknown whether they were dead or alive. There was an obvious dent in the wall behind them. It was obvious that they had been thrown out like a sandbag and smashed against the wall. At this time, the Medicine King tripod was stored on a display stand, protected by a thick bulletproof glass cover. It was safe and sound. The head of security was about to breathe a sigh of relief when he suddenly heard a loud crash. The hard and thick glass cover instantly shattered, as if it had been slapped by an invisible hand. As soon as the glass cover was smashed, the Medicine King tripod floated up out of thin air. The head of security was shocked when he saw this. He pulled out the pistol from his waist and was about to shoot. But there was nothing in front of him. The Medicine King tripod was also floating in the air. Or was there anyone? Just as he was hesitating, he suddenly felt a strong gust of wind, as if he was pushed by a giant hand. Then his whole body flew out and hit the wall with a loud bang. Then his body softly fell to the ground. Zhou Qin's eyes widened and she shouted in a low voice, "Goddess Nyan Seal?" She quickly pulled out the Vulcan's whip wrapped around her waist and shook her wrist. The long whip made a loud sound of breaking through the air and lashed in the direction of the Medicine King tripod. With a paw sound, the Vulcan's whip suddenly hit something. The tip of the Vulcan's whip instantly refracted a faint ripple, so that Zhou Qin and others could vaguely recognize that it was an invisible man about 2 meters tall. But as soon as Zhou Qin whipped him, the invisible man's figure disappeared in an instant, and he rushed towards the window with a howl. "Oh no, he's going to steal the Medicine King tripod!" Zi Yuan suddenly shouted, "Stop him!" A purple light flashed beside Zi Yuan in an instant, and the ninth heaven Zi Yuan silk instantly appeared in front of the invisible man like a big net. With a muffled sound, the ninth heaven Zi Yuan silk seemed to have been hit heavily by a huge palm in an instant, forming a terrible claw print. Zi Yuan saw that the hand was tightly wrapped by the ninth heaven Zi Yuan silk, so it showed traces. The fingers of this hand were thick and long, and the nails were as sharp as bayonets. The muscles on the arm were even more bumpy, like a sack full of potatoes. It didn't look like a human arm at all. With a move of her mind, Zi Yuan quickly controlled the ninth heaven Zi Yuan silk to extend quickly, entangling the invisible humanoid monster. With a schwa sound, the Vulcan's whip in Zhou Qin's hand was also thrown out, and it tightly wrapped around his ankle. As soon as her Vulcan's whip was wrapped around, there was a burst of fire at one end of the Vulcan's whip with a bang, constantly burning the invisible monster. The monster seemed to know that he couldn't escape. He took a deep breath and roared in the direction of the glass window. Howl! The invisible monster's mouth fiercely emitted a shockwave. This loud roar suddenly shook the entire building. Shen Wankai was knocked out without saying a word. Although the glass window that bore the brunt of the impact was hard-tempered glass, it was shaken by the strong shockwave and immediately shattered with a crash. The invisible monster held the Medicine King cauldron in its other hand and threw it out. At the moment he threw it out, His upper body was completely entangled by the ninth heaven Ziyuan silk, and his lower body and ankles began to burn with raging fire. For a moment, the monster let out a terrible howl, and in the blink of an eye, it turned into a black smoke and disappeared. Ziyuan and Zhou Qin's faces changed greatly, and they said in unison, "Oh no, it's the Medicine King tripod." At the moment when the Medicine King tripod was thrown out, a figure flashed past them, and Ao Wushuang chased after it like lightning. In the blink of an eye, Ao Wushuang chased after the Medicine King tripod. She reached out to take it, but suddenly felt a terrible force coming from behind her. This force was not only fierce, but also full of powerful Buddhist power, which happened to restrain her demon power. She suddenly shivered and quickly dodged. Ao Wushuang's figure flashed, and a golden light immediately flashed in her original position. This golden light did not stop. In an instant, it passed through the Medicine King tripod and pulled it to the horizon. Ao Wushuang was furious. She gritted her teeth and was about to chase after it. But suddenly her heart moved, as if she had thought of something. For a moment, she couldn't help but hesitate. The battle between masters only lasted for an instant. As Ao Wushuang hesitated, the Medicine King tripod and the golden light instantly disappeared into the horizon. At this time, it was too late to chase after them. Ao Wushuang's eyes flickered as she looked in the direction where the Medicine King tripod had disappeared. She snorted coldly to herself, and her figure flashed, and she instantly returned to the inner hall. When Ziyuan and Zhou Qin saw that Ao Wushuang had returned in the blink of an eye with empty hands, their hearts suddenly thumped, and at the same time, an ominous thought flashed through their minds. Zhou Qin was shocked and said, "Senior Ao Wushuang, where is the Medicine King tripod?" Ao Wushuang shook her head and sighed. "I didn't catch up." Ziyuan couldn't help but be moved. "Even you didn't catch up? Who the hell is this person?" Ao Wushuang's expression was a little unnatural. She was about to speak when she saw many people rushing into the room. There were cultivators from various sects, Shen Wansai's daughter, Shen Hui, Li Yundong and Su Chan. What happened? Li Yundong looked at the messy scene in the room in shock. Su Chan glanced around and asked subconsciously, "Have you been robbed?" Seeing that Su Chan's subconscious words had hit the nail on the head, Ziyuan and Zhou Qin looked at each other and smiled bitterly. Ao Wushuang walked up to Li Yundong and said with a look of shame, "Leader, I failed to live up to your trust, and let someone take away the Medicine King tripod in front of me." "What? The Medicine King tripod was taken away?" When the others in the room heard this, they almost jumped up and shouted in surprise. Some cultivators from the cultivation sects pointed at Ao Wushuang and took the opportunity to attack her. "What are you doing? You can't even keep an eye on such an important thing as the Medicine King tripod. Ao Wushuang, tell me, did you take it for yourself?" "Ao Wushuang, were you instructed by Li Yundong?" Ao Wushuang's face was as cold as frost, and the anger between her eyebrows was getting stronger and stronger. Just as she was about to lose her temper, Li Yundong suddenly turned his head and shouted angrily, "Shut up!" Although Li Yundong's voice was not very loud, it contained the power of a Buddhist staff. Everyone only felt a buzzing sound in their ears, as if thousands of bells were ringing at the same time, shaking the qi and blood in their chests. The people who had been noisy before were suddenly shocked and shut their mouths one after another. Zhou Qin, who was standing to one side, also said angrily, "You idiots. Just now, Mr. Shen wanted to give my master the Medicine King tripod, but my master didn't immediately agree. What reason does he have to steal it?" This question made everyone speechless for a while. Some of those who wanted to find fault with him also snorted and didn't say anything. Li Yundong's face was as dark as water. He took a deep breath and asked Ziyuan in a low voice what had happened. After pondering for a while, he said angrily, "Damn it, we fell into the trap of luring the tiger away from the mountain and creating a ruckus in the east while attacking in the west." Ziyuan asked in a low voice, "Did someone on your side make it on purpose just now?" Li Yundong nodded. The movement there just now attracted the attention of almost all cultivators. When we went over to take a look, we saw an invisible monster running amok. After we subdued it, We heard some movement from your side. And then the Medicine King tripod was lost. As Li Yundong spoke, he gritted his teeth and said, "There are so many cultivators here, but they can take things away under our noses. Good method, good method. What a daring person. Who on earth is so bold?" At this time, Ao Wushuang also came over and whispered, "I know who it is." Li Yundong immediately raised his eyes and asked in a deep voice, "Who?" Ao Wushuang shook her head. "Let's go back and talk. It's not convenient to talk here." Li Yundong nodded. He walked to Shen Hui's side and whispered a few words, asking her to take good care of Shen Wangkai. Then he walked out with Su Chan and the others. Seeing this, Zhou Ping couldn't help whispering to Zhang Ling, "Master, are we just going to let them go like this? This matter is very strange." Zhang Ling raised her hand and said in a deep voice, "Let them go. They didn't do it." Zhou Ping was stunned. "Why?" Zhang Ling stared at Li Yundong with bright eyes and sneered. With Li Yundong's current strength and the situation just now, there's no need for him to play such a trick. Hearing Zhang Ling's words, Li Yundong turned his face to look at Zhang Ling, nodded, and then turned to leave. Jingyi School was not only a leading figure in the Taoist cultivation world, but also had a great influence in the Buddhist cultivation world. As soon as Zhang Ling spoke, the cultivators of all sects on the scene no longer stopped them, and made way for them. Li Yundong and the others filed out. Just as they were about to leave, the police who had been arranged around the auction house rushed over. A leading policeman shouted at Li Yundong, "Hey, you can't leave. You are all suspects. You have to stay and make statements." This was the second time yesterday. Chapter 617. Li Yundong frowned, and turned around to take a look. This look was not angry, but it was powerful. The policeman's heart beat inexplicably, and he swallowed all the words he wanted to say. Zhou Qin had been entrusted by Li Yundong to take care of Shen Wangkai. But Shen Wangkai had been knocked unconscious under her nose, and the Medicine King tripod had been snatched away. She had nowhere to vent her anger. At this time, seeing that someone had come to provoke her, she immediately turned her head and shouted at the policeman, "If you have the ability, try to keep us here. Call your director here, and see if he dares to say such a thing to me." The policeman was shocked by Zhou Qin's tone, but he soon became furious. He had been paid a lot of money to be responsible for the security of the auction, but he hadn't expected such a problem to occur. Now he was looking for someone to take the blame, but he hadn't expected that someone would come to his door and dare to fight against him. Just as he was about to act, a policeman immediately came over and whispered in his ear, "Hey, Captain Sun. It seems to be Governor Zhou's daughter. Don't mess around." Captain Sun was stunned and said in a low voice, "Governor Zhou's daughter? Zhou Kachang?" In China, if one wanted to be a qualified public official, or if one wanted to be promoted smoothly, it was necessary to know the names and positions of leaders at all levels, and some of their immediate family members. They could have all kinds of misunderstandings and conflicts with ordinary people countless times, but they could never have a misunderstanding and conflict with their superiors. Because if they offended the people, no matter how serious the consequences were, they would at most be dismissed and transferred. After the situation calmed down, they could be quietly promoted back. But if they offended the leaders, they would never be able to get ahead in their lives. Captain Sun looked at Zhou Qin carefully and saw that the girl in front of him was full of heroic spirit. Her eyes were tough and domineering. It was obvious that she had been in a high position for a long time. No matter how good an actor was, he or she would not be able to put on such a show. Captain Sun's anger disappeared. He said with an apologetic smile, "It turns out to be Governor Zhou's daughter. I'm sorry. The flood rushed to the Dragon King Temple." Seeing that he had given in, Zhou Qin didn't want to pester him anymore. She snorted coldly and turned around to leave. But at this time, Zhang Ling and Zhou Ping also walked out. Zhou Ping sneered and said, "How impressive! If you were half as powerful as you are now, how could the Medicine King tripod have been snatched away?" Zhou Qin's face suddenly turned red. She was furious and wanted to refute, But on second thought, she realized that it was indeed the case. This proud and arrogant young lady was so angry that she couldn't speak. She stood rooted to the ground, her eyes filled with unwillingness and anger. Li Yundong glanced at Zhou Ping with a sullen face, then turned to Zhou Qin and said softly, "It's my fault. It's my mistake, it has nothing to do with you. This person can take away the Medicine King tripod under the eyes of you, Zi Yuan, and Senior Ao Wushuang, which means that this person must not be ordinary. And those who dare to snatch the Medicine King tripod in this situation must have an extremely deep background." As Li Yundong spoke, he glanced at Zhou Ping. Intentionally or unintentionally, Zhou Ping suddenly jumped up like a rabbit whose tail had been stepped on and shouted, "What are you looking at? What do you mean?" Zhang Ling reached out to stop Zhou Ping. She snorted and said, "Jinrenli, there's no need to say such meaningful words. Yes, in terms of strength and background, the most suspicious one here is indeed our Jingyi school. But our Jingyi school is righteous, stable, and has a clear conscience. This Medicine King tripod is the supreme powerful magical weapon of our Taoist school, and it is also a treasure left by our ancestors. As juniors, we don't cherish it, but we lose it. It doesn't seem good? In my opinion, every cultivation sect has the responsibility to find it back. What do you think?" Li Yundong saw that Zhang Ling's words were dignified, but there was no mention of whether or not it would be returned to its original owner after it was found. Moreover, her subtext was, now that the Medicine King tripod has become an ownerless object, whoever gets it will naturally belong to whoever gets it. This sentence hit a deep trap. If Li Yundong followed Zhang Ling's words, he was afraid that he would immediately fall into the trap and suffer a great loss. But Li Yundong's mind moved, and he understood the key point. He smiled slightly and said in the same dignified manner, "Jinren Zhang, you're right. The Medicine King tripod is the supreme powerful magical weapon of our Taoist school, and everyone has the responsibility to find it back. But since the Medicine King tripod was lost under our noses, it should be found by us. What do you think?" Zhang Ling saw that Li Yundong had easily resolved her words, which were full of traps and deep pits, and at the same time, kicked a ball over. There was a needle hidden in the silk floss, and there was a hidden meaning in his words. It was very difficult to deal with him. Zhang Ling stared at Li Yundong for a long time. Suddenly, she put on a fake smile and said, "Jinrenli, take care of yourself." Li Yundong also smiled and cupped his hands. "Jinren Zhang, goodbye." After that, he turned around and left with Su Chan, Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, Ao Wushuang and Chris. Zhang Ling stared at Li Yundong's back. After a long time, she sighed secretly and shook her head. Amazing, really amazing. Zhou Ping also looked in the direction in which Li Yundong and the others had left and sneered. Even the Medicine King tripod can't be guarded. What's so amazing about it? Zhang Ling shook her head and said, "No, the other party is also a master. When masters fight, they must fight for the first opportunity. Whoever can seize the first opportunity will win. So this is not the fault of the battle. If it were us, we would also be trapped." Zhou Ping asked curiously, "Master, what do you think about him?" Zhang Ling looked at Li Yundong's figure that had gone far away and sighed. This Li Yundong came out of nowhere half a year ago. When he first made his debut, he was very young and inexperienced. When he talked to me just now, he already had some of the demeanor of a real leader. Hey! It's not surprising that he has such a cultivation quotient at such a young age. But what's surprising is that he reacted so quickly just now. He was able to perceive my intentions so quickly and counterattack. For a young man of his age, it's really incredible and commendable that his words and actions are so watertight. Zhou Ping curled her lips disapprovingly. So what? Isn't he just a leader of a group of evildoers? Thousands of years later, the world will only know what our Jingyi school is like, but who will know what Li Yundong is like? Zhang Ling chuckled and said meaningfully, "You idiot. He is still the leader of the Fox Zen school. You should be happy." Zhou Ping was tongue-tied. "Master, what do you mean?" Zhang Ling said, "No matter how powerful Li Yundong is, It's impossible for him to transform the Fox Zen school into a cultivation sect that can stand side by side with us. Because the Fox Zen school has been notorious for thousands of years, this is no longer something that can be reversed by individual strength. But if Li Yundong creates his own sect, hey, I dare say that he will definitely become a great master and become our great enemy. Although Zhou Ping had heard Zhang Ling's comments on Li Yundong more or less, this was the first time she had heard her master praise this cultivator, who had a deep grudge against their Jingyi school. Zhou Ping opened her mouth wide and wanted to refute, but she didn't know how to say it. After a long time she snorted and said, "Let's wait and see." After Li Yundong and the others returned to their home in Tianan City, as soon as they entered the door, Li Yundong's face immediately fell. Someone had dared to steal the Medicine King tripod under his nose. This really made him feel like he had lost all face. When the little foxes at home saw Li Yundong and the others coming back, they also surrounded them curiously. They were about to chatter and ask about the auction, but they saw that Li Yundong's face was as dark as a dark cloud, as if thunder would break out at any time. All of a sudden, none of them dared to speak and hid to the side in a low voice. Zhou Qin, who was standing to one side, immediately bent her knees and was about to kneel down to admit her mistake. Li Yundong immediately stopped her with his hand and said in a deep voice, "Zhou Qin, as I said, this matter is not your fault but mine." As he said this, Li Yundong turned his face and said to Ao Wushuang, "Senior Ao Wushuang, you said that you know who took the Medicine King tripod? Who is it?" Ao Wushuang hesitated for a moment and said, "I'm not sure, but according to my deduction, it's very likely that it's someone from Xingyan Tantrism." Someone from Xingyan Tantrism? Li Yundong was stunned. He quickly clapped his fists and said angrily, "Yes, it must be them. I think it's very likely to be Saionji Tsunekatsu. Did they steal the Medicine King tripod to lure me to Japan?" Ziyuan also nodded slightly and said, "It's very possible. From a logical point of view, it makes sense. Moreover, before and after that, Saionji Tsunekatsu and Tuki were nowhere to be seen." Zhou Qin had been holding back her anger before, and at this time, she couldn't help but shout angrily, "Master, let's go and burn this Mount Koya." Ziyuan burst into laughter and horror, and shook her head repeatedly. No, Zhou Qin, don't be impulsive. Mount Koya is not a place for fun. In Japan, the status of Mount Koya in the Japanese cultivation world is equivalent to that of Taoism in Mount Longhu and Buddhism in Mount Wutai. You can't act recklessly. Otherwise, you will go in standing and come out horizontally. Zhou Qin said angrily. Then are we just going to swallow this anger? As she said this, she turned to Chris and said, "Chris, you judge. If it were you, would you be able to swallow this anger?" Seeing that the group of people were excited, Chris felt that she was an outsider, so she didn't dare to say anything. She just forced a smile and didn't say anything. Seeing that she couldn't get any help from Chris, Zhou Qin turned to Su Chan and said, "Su Chan, what do you think?" Su Chan blinked her eyes and looked at Li Yundong. Her eyes seemed to be saying, "I'll listen to Yundong. I'll do what he says." At this time, everyone's eyes were on Li Yundong. Li Yundong's face was gloomy. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly saw a letter slowly floating in from outside the balcony. "Hey, there's a letter." Su Chan also quickly found it. She shouted curiously. The letter slowly floated down on the tea table in the living room, as if someone was holding it. Everyone took a look, and saw that the envelope was exactly the same as the challenge sent by Saionji Tsunekatsu last time. The paper was full of cherry blossoms. Zhou Qin walked to the tea table in 3 steps, picked up the envelope, and handed it to Li Yundong with a sneer. "Master, I bet this must be another challenge." Li Yundong calmly took out the letter. After reading a few lines, he flew into a rage. He suddenly crumpled the letter into a ball and shouted angrily, "The Japanese have gone too far. How dare they use such despicable means? Do they really think I'm weak and easy to bully?" Seeing this, Ziyuan squatted down and picked up the ball of paper. As soon as she spread out the letter, Su Chan, Zhou Qin, Ao Wushuang, and the little foxes also came over curiously. They saw that the handwriting on the letter was domineering, and the words were full of pride. The letter read, Li Yundong, I've long heard of your reputation as a great Jinren, but I haven't seen you for a long time. I had to take the risk and come up with this plan to see the true face of Jinren Li. However, I did not expect that none of the Chinese cultivators in the hall would be able to stop me in the slightest. Apart from being shocked, I am greatly disappointed. I can't imagine that the cultivation world of China, which was a country of 10,000 countries, was actually so incompetent. Although I'm the young monk of Ergoino, I feel deeply ashamed of the cultivation world of your country. I've been begging Jinren Li for a long time, but I can't get him. Is that the reason? If Jinren Li feels that there is no hope of winning, you can say it frankly. Reputation is just a worldly possession. Why do you care? If Jinren Li still has a bit of courage, you can go to Mount Koya in 7 days to retrieve the Medicine King tripod of your Chinese cultivation world. No matter who wins or loses, I will return the Medicine King tripod to Jinren Li. But if Jinren Li is too timid to come, then this Medicine King tripod will be a powerful magical weapon of our Yamato people. When everyone saw this, they immediately became angry and became bold. This was not a challenge, it was clearly a provocation. Chapter 6:18. Before Su Chan and Zhou Qin finished reading, they immediately shouted in anger. Su Chan said angrily, This Japanese guy is so arrogant. Yundong, you must teach them a good lesson. Zhou Qin was so angry that her 2 willowy eyebrows stood up. B****. It's too hateful. How dare he look down on me like this? Although Zi Yuan's eyes were full of anger, she quickly calmed down and said to Li Yundong, Li Yundong, this is a provocation. Li Yundong laughed angrily and said, Don't I know that this Japanese guy is provoking me? Hey, he wants me to go so much. Fine. I'll do as he wishes. With that, Li Yundong turned his head and shouted at Su Chan, Go get a pen and paper. Su Chan immediately responded, turned her head, and rushed into the room. After a while, she ran out quickly with the 4 treasures of the study, ink, paper, and inkstone. Li Yundong turned to Zi Yuan and said, Zi Yuan, you write it. Since they challenged me, well, write a challenge and give it back to them. Seeing this, Su Chan immediately ran to one side and said, Sister Zi Yuan, I'll help you grind the ink. Seeing that Li Yundong was angry at this time, Zi Yuan sighed softly and didn't try to persuade him anymore. She walked up gracefully, grabbed her sleeve with one hand, and held the brush with the other. She turned her head to look at Li Yundong and asked, What do you want to write? Li Yundong said angrily, Write as you see fit. If I write it, it will definitely be full of swearing words. Zi Yuan couldn't help laughing. She shook her head and raised the brush to write, but when the tip of the brush fell on the white paper, she hesitated again. This kind of challenge could not be written randomly. It was very particular about the words and sentences. Moreover, when it was sent to the other side, it would definitely be recorded. Maybe it would become a historical material thousands of years later. If she didn't pay attention to her words, it would cause future generations to gossip about her. Zi Yuan was born to worry too much. Her habitual hesitation made Li Yundong, who was beside her, a little impatient. This reincarnated wisdom king, who was usually calm and composed, and could not be moved by the wind, was indeed enraged by the aggressiveness of Xinyan tantrism again and again. Li Yundong saw that Zi Yuan had been holding the brush for a long time. He walked over and unceremoniously snatched the brush from Zi Yuan's hand. He waved the brush and wrote 6 big words. If you want to fight, then let's fight. After Li Yundong finished writing, he didn't even look at it. He turned his head and said to Zi Yuan, Why are you thinking so much? Since the other party was being polite, we should naturally reply politely. If the other party is arrogant and rude, are we supposed to be polite? Sometimes, you are so kind that there is no limit to your kindness. Wrap this letter in the simplest envelope and send it over. Zi Yuan saw that the words written by Li Yundong were crooked. It was really a kind of praise to describe them with the words ghost drawing peach talisman. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry and said, "I'm not being polite to them. I'm just worried that I'll lose your face if I don't write it well. Besides, aren't you afraid that other sects will laugh at you for taking a simple envelope?" Li Yundong laughed angrily and said, "It's good that I didn't write it on toilet paper. If they annoy me, I'll write it on a piece of paper and send it to them one day. They only deserve to see this." Su Chan and Zhou Qin couldn't help laughing. Ao Wushuang also shook her head and said with a smile, "Child's temper, nonsense, really nonsense." Zi Yuan looked like she wanted to laugh, but was too embarrassed to do so. She looked at Li Yundong's crooked words and said, "Well, since you're happy, let's do it this way. But, are you sure you want to send these words over?" At this time, Su Chan and Zhou Qin also came over to take a look curiously. Both of them were excellent women, so they were naturally very particular about the way of writing. They saw that Li Yundong's words were crooked, and the most important thing was that the first few words were long and thin. The last word, Zhan, had been written by Li Yundong like two words, Zhan and Ge. It looked strange and really unsightly. Su Chan couldn't help but burst into laughter. But soon she covered her mouth and looked at Li Yundong with a frightened and nervous face, for fear that he would blame her and spank her. The corners of Zhou Qin's mouth also curled up, as if she couldn't help laughing, but she quickly held it back. Her face was full of bitterness, hatred and pain. Li Yundong naturally knew what his handwriting was like. He had been in a fit of anger just now, so how could he care so much? He hadn't expected to make a fool of himself on the spot. His face turned red and he glared at Zhou Qin. "What's with your expression?" Zhou Qin said with a sullen face. "Master, these words of yours are so well written. They really reveal their true feelings from the bottom of their hearts. When people see them, they feel a wave of anger rushing towards them." Li Yundong was so angry that he laughed. "Bullshit, bullshit. Are you praising me or scolding me?" At this time Su Chan, who had been holding back her laughter, finally couldn't help it. She burst out laughing, which immediately made Li Yundong glare at her. "Your words are beautiful. You write it." Su Chan quickly shook her hands vigorously. No, my words are not suitable for such an angry body." Li Yundong laughed angrily and said, "I'm also a roaring body." As he said this, he turned his head and glared at Zhou Qin. "Come on, stop pretending. You write it. Your words are the most suitable. Just write these 6 words." Zhou Qin tried hard to hold back her laughter. She walked to the table, grabbed her sleeve with one hand, and picked up the brush with the other. She took a deep breath and calmed herself down, as if she wanted to cultivate her emotions. Zhou Qin raised her head and closed her eyes, silently reciting the provocation she had just seen. When she opened her eyes again, they were full of anger. She quickly picked up the brush and wrote 6 murderous words. "If you want to fight, then let's fight." Everyone saw that these 6 words were full of killing intent. They were really vertical and horizontal like spears and swords, and the momentum between the lines was majestic. They immediately cheered. Even Chris, an American who didn't understand grass, couldn't help but feel a fierce murderous aura coming towards her, which made her hair stand on end. Li Yundong looked at these 6 words and nodded repeatedly. He said with great satisfaction, "Well, just like that. Send it over." Su Chan asked curiously, "Yundong, can't you just go directly? Why do you have to send someone over?" At this time, Zi Yuan said with a smile, "That won't do. This is the rule between sections. Although the other party is rude, this kind of etiquette rule can't be abolished." Li Yundong laughed and said, "I don't care about these bullshit rules. I just want to reciprocate. It would be impolite of me not to reciprocate. If they dare to provoke me, I will provoke them 100 times more." Zhou Qin's eyes lit up when she heard this. She asked, "Master, let me send it." Li Yundong glanced at her and said, "You?" Zhou Qin chuckled and said, "Zi Yuan is the future leader of the Linggong sect, and the other party is not the leader. Therefore, according to the principle of reciprocity, Zi Yuan can't go. Otherwise it would be a favor to them." Su Chan asked curiously, "What about me?" Before Zhou Qin could speak, Li Yundong shook his head and said, You can't. I don't trust you." Su Chan's mouth suddenly pouted, and she looked unhappy. Li Yundong had to explain. It's not that I don't trust you. I just think that your character and strength are not suitable for this matter. You are right, not right. Do you understand? Oh, Su Chan said, pouted and stopped talking. Zhou Qin looked at Ao Wushuang again. Ao Wushuang was a smart person. When she saw Zhou Qin's expression, she knew that she wanted to go. So she took the initiative to say with a smile, I'm even more unsuitable to go. The Japanese cultivation world is one of the mortal enemies of our Fox Zen school. I'm a fox spirit, and more than 10 years ago, I had some conflicts with the Japanese cultivators of various sects in Japan. If I go there, I'm afraid I won't be able to return. Li Yundong asked curiously, why did you say that? How did the Japanese cultivation world become one of the mortal enemies of the Fox Zen school? Ao Wushuang smiled slightly and said with some emotion, back then, when the mystical silver fox was practicing the 9th phase of the heavenly Jindan technique, she provoked the divine tribulation. At this time, the cultivation world of various sects took the opportunity to besiege her and break her 3 souls and 7 spirits. In order to protect herself, the mystical silver fox threw the life soul of the 3 souls, as well as the 3 souls of the 7 souls, Tianchong, Linghui and Central Center, into the 6 paths of reincarnation. At the same time, she transformed the earth soul, the spirit soul, and the power soul into the body of an ordinary fox, and fled into the deep mountains and forests. In addition, the rest of her spiritual energy and her memory merged into the remaining heaven soul, essence soul, and heroic soul, and fled all the way to the east. After the mystical silver fox fled to Japan, she lurked beside the ruler of Japan at that time, Emperor Niuyu, in an attempt to recuperate and make a comeback. But what she didn't expect was that there was a very powerful cultivator next to Emperor Niuyu, who discovered her true body. Li Yundong was a little stunned. He couldn't help asking, wait, did the mystical silver fox hide in Japan at that time? Ao Wushuang nodded. That's right. Li Yundong asked in surprise. At that time, did the mystical silver fox still change her name to Tamamo no Mei? Ao Wushuang nodded slowly. Yes, Tamamo no Mei was a famous 9-tailed celestial fox in the Japanese cultivation world, and even in myths and legends. As for her origin, the Japanese cultivation world unanimously believed that she was a fox demon from China, and then fled to Japan from China. But some people said that she originated from India. But where exactly did she come from was unknown. Although Zhou Qin hadn't cultivated for long, and didn't know much about the cultivation world, she was still clear about such a famous mythical figure as Tamamo no Mei. Zhou Qin asked in shock, that's not right. I know that Tamamo no Mei is a 9-tailed celestial fox, but didn't she sneak back to Japan in the Tang dynasty on the ship of the Japanese envoy? Ao Wushuang sneered. It's the same excuse as the Zhengyi school and the Jinshan sect. It's just a whitewash. At that time, the imperial palace of Japan was full of masters, but they accidentally let a fox demon sneak in and lurk around the emperor. What a great shame and humiliation it was. If it weren't for the serious illness of the emperor of Bird Feather at that time, which made others suspicious, they wouldn't have been able to find the location of the mystical silver fox in another 100 years. Zhou Qin said strangely, but that's not right. The mystical silver fox followed Ji Bei into the imperial palace. Isn't that shameful? Ao Wushuang said with a smile. At that time, the envoys of the Tang dynasty were extremely respected people. Whether it was Ji Bei or the famous Abe Nakamaru in history, they would be greatly respected when they returned to their country. They had the special treatment of not kneeling when they saw the emperor, and not being polite when they saw the princes. At that time, Japan's desire and worship for the culture of the Tang dynasty were crazy and unreasonable. The Japanese once thought that as long as it came from the Tang dynasty, it must be good. Therefore, the people around these envoys of the Tang dynasty would not be investigated. Besides, at that time, the envoys of the Tang dynasty brought back many cultivation magic arts from various sects in the cultivation world of the Tang dynasty. Even if the Japanese cultivators saw them at that time, They would respect them. How could they doubt them? Therefore, if the mystical silver fox really wanted to follow them into the imperial palace, it would be a piece of cake. As Ao Wushuang said this, he sneered and said, "It's a pity that their excuse is decent, but for the discerning people in the cultivation world, it's full of loopholes." Ji Bei returned to China during the period of Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang dynasty, but in that period, our Fox Zen school had not yet been established. Guangong Fa Qin Xiong. Humph, what a joke. Only then did Zhou Qin understand. I see. The one who appeared the mystical silver fox. Is it Abe Yasuo? Ao Wushuang's face suddenly darkened. Yes. The Abe family is the sworn enemy of our Fox Zen school. At that time, it was the Yin-Yang master Abe Taiching who sealed the soul and spirit of the mystical silver fox in a huge rock. As she said this, Ao Wushuang turned to Li Yundong and said very seriously, "Leader, if you really go to Mount Koya, you must pay attention to the Yin-Yang master of the Abe family. This is one of the oldest cultivation families in the Japanese cultivation world. It is extremely powerful. You must be careful." Li Yundong laughed and said, "Yin-Yang master?" Their Yin-Yang skills were passed down from the 100 schools of thought in the spring and autumn warring states period. I'd like to meet them if I have the chance. As Li Yundong said this, he turned to Zhou Qin and said, "Now it seems that it's indeed the best for you to go. But you have to be careful. Try not to mention our Fox Zen school, and pick on their shortcomings. Of course, it's best to put down the letter and leave. There's no need to talk nonsense with them. It's useless to talk to them. If you talk too much, they will think you're afraid. I think the best way to deal with them is still the same word. Fight." Seeing that Li Yundong had agreed to go to Mount Koya, Zhou Qin was overjoyed. She nodded heavily and said, "Master, don't worry. I won't let you down." After that, she sneered in her heart and said, "Japanese, just wait and see. My master is magnanimous, and won't let me scold people. Humph, I don't have such a good temper. If I don't scold you, I'll take your surname. ====. I suddenly remembered that in chapter 614, a friend pointed out that there was a bug in it. Rongwa didn't buy the ivory Arhut tower. But I made a mistake at that time, and wrote that he had bought the ivory tower. Later, after being pointed out by a friend, I have changed it. I hereby sincerely apologize to all of you. I will pay more attention to it in the future. In addition, thank you for the 800 VIP tickets Swordfinger Dongwu generously gave me. I thank you very much. Chapter 619. Early in the morning the next day, Zhou Qin went out early, because she was going deep into the tiger's den and setting foot in another cultivation world. Zhou Qin had made all the preparations and homework that night. For her safety, Li Jiandong gave the colorful brocade bag and the liuha to Zhou Qin and asked her to take them with her. Bubble. Book. Okay. In order to emphasize her official background, Zhou Qin did not fly to Mount Koya all the way with her yang spirit body. Instead, she chose to take a train to Shanghai first, and then take a plane to Osaka. Mount Koya was located in Koya Town, Edo County, Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. After arriving in Osaka by plane, Zhou Qin took a train to Mount Koya, and finally took a cable car up the mountain. Because it was the transition between late winter and early spring, there was a heavy snow in Edo County. The white snow decorated Mount Koya with silver. In addition, the geographical location of Mount Koya was relatively high, and the temperature on the mountain was more than 10 degrees lower than that on the flat ground, which was particularly cold. Because of such heavy snow, Mount Koya had been closed early. When Zhou Qin went up the mountain, she found that there were few people in the huge Mount Koya. Only a few monks in brown monk robes and yellow bamboo hats were walking slowly at the foot of Mount Koya. Zhou Qin looked at them and saw that these people were holding heavy vajra pestles. Although the weather was cold, they were all barefoot and wearing straw sandals walking in the snow. The vajra in the hands of these monks was surprisingly long, about 1.6 meters high. There was a copper ring hanging on one end of the vajra. Every time the monk took a step, the copper ring on the vajra would make a fixed crisp sound. This sound echoed in the empty and gloomy Mount Koya, which was particularly ethereal and mysterious. These monks were like monks patrolling the mountain. When they saw Zhou Qin at a glance, they walked straight over. The leading monk formed a palm with one hand, saluted, and said a few words in Japanese. Zhou Qin's English was excellent, but she couldn't understand Japanese. She looked reserved and said in Chinese with a hint of sarcasm, "I have something to ask your Lord Masako Tachibana." The leading monk was stunned for a moment, as if he hadn't expected that the woman in front of him was not a Japanese. He turned his head and glanced at a monk behind him. Then a monk looked at Zhou Qin strangely. He stepped forward, leaning on the Vajra pestle in one hand, and saluted with the other. He said in standard Chinese, "Benefactor, I think you are mistaken. There is no Masako Tachibana here. Moreover, everyone is equal in front of Buddha. How can there be such a thing as an adult or a lowly person?" Japanese Buddhism originated in China and was deeply influenced by Chinese Buddhism. Most of the scriptures collected in many Japanese temples were original works in Chinese, and some of them even had bilingual translations in Chinese and Japanese. In the past, if one wanted to become a real eminent monk in Japan, it was impossible not to know Chinese. In addition, Mount Koya was a famous tourist attraction. Every year, a large number of Chinese tourists came to enjoy it, so there were many monks in the temple who were good at Chinese. Zhou Qin even felt that the Japanese monks' Chinese was more fluent than many Chinese people's. However, the other party actually denied the existence of Masako Tachibana. Zhou Qin couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. She asked, "Aren't you monks from Kongabuji Temple?" The monks smiled and said, "This is Kongabuji Temple, and we are all monks here. But today, because of the heavy snow, Mount Koya has been closed. If you want to go sightseeing, I'm afraid you will be disappointed today." Only then did Zhou Qin understand that because she had restrained her qi all the way here, the other party had regarded her as an ordinary person, so he wanted to ask her to leave. Zhou Qin smiled slightly. She glanced at the Vajra pestle in the monk's hand and said, "How long is the Vajra pestle in your hand? 16 fingers? 20 fingers? One end of your Vajra pestle is in the shape of a ring drum, and the other end is in the shape of a triangular point. In the middle of the Vajra pestle, there are 3 Buddha statues as handles. One Buddha statue is smiling, one is angry, and the other is scolding. Hey, if I'm not mistaken, this should be the Vajra pestle that is specially used to subdue demons and defend the Tao, right?" The monk looked surprised. He looked at Zhou Qin carefully and asked in confusion, "How do you know this?" Zhou Qin laughed. She touched her waist with her hand, and a silver light flashed quickly in front of her. Qi instantly appeared in front of her and floated in the air. Under the reflection of the pure white snow, this chainsaw Vajra chakram appeared particularly stunning. Its entire body was emitting a dazzling silver light, and the exquisite patterns engraved on its surface were surging with waves of silver ripples, looking magnificent and magnificent. Zhou Qin smiled and said, "Because I also have such a treasure to subdue demons and defend the Tao." Only then did the monk realize that the other party was also a cultivator. His face suddenly changed, and he asked in a deep voice, "Who the hell are you?" The other monks around the monk also slowly dispersed with vigilant expressions. They quietly surrounded Zhou Qin in the middle, eyeing her covetously. Zhou Qin knew that she was alone and weak, so she definitely couldn't fight with them. After all, this was the Xinyan Tantrism, and it was not a place to play. If she fought with them, she would not only humiliate herself, but the most embarrassing thing was that Li Jiandong would also come to save her. That would be a great shame. Zhou Qin smiled slightly and waved her hand. Qi instantly flew into the colorful brocade pouch around her waist. She said with a smile, "My name is Zhou Qin. I want to see your goddess, Masako Tachibana." The monk's face was as dark as water. He said, "How can you see Masako Tachibana whenever you want?" Zhou Qin couldn't help laughing. "Just now you said that everyone is equal in front of Buddha, but now you keep saying that Masako Tachibana is long and Masako Tachibana is short. Since everyone is equal, why can't I see her?" The monk's face changed. He put the vajra in his hand on the snow and shouted coldly, "What a sharp-tongued woman! Are you here to make trouble for us in Mount Koya?" The surrounding monks also stopped the vajra in their hands. The ring-shaped copper rings at the top of the pestle collided with each other, making an ear-piercing bell sound. The surrounding air shook, revealing a sharp killing intent. Zhou Qin glanced at them and said with a sneer, "I think you've made a mistake. It's your Lord Masako Tachibana who begged to see me. It's not that I want to see her." As the head of the Masako family, although she was not a member of the Xinyan Tantrism, she was the great minister of the Xinyan Tantrism. Moreover, the Masako family had a very close relationship with the great monks of all generations. Although strictly speaking, the people of the Masako family were not cultivators of the Xinyan Tantrism. They were women who held great power and were highly respected in the Xinyan Tantrism. In Japan, a world where men were superior to women and the upper and lower classes were extremely strict, the Masako family was a rare power and strength among Japanese women. Even after the Masako family and the great monks of Mount Koya merged for several generations, the cultivators of the Xinyan Tantrism had begun to respect and worship the people of the Masako family as the guardians of the Xinyan Tantrism. When the monk heard Zhou Qin's words, he was immediately furious and shouted, "How dare you? How dare you be disrespectful to Masako Tachibana?" He raised the vajra in his hand, pointed to the foot of the mountain and shouted, "Please leave immediately, or don't blame us for being rude." Zhou Qin was not angry but laughed. She glanced at the monk and sneered, "You want me to leave? Well, don't regret it later." With that she turned her head and left. When the other monks saw her leave, they did not stop her, but stared at her back vigilantly. When the monk who could speak Chinese saw Zhou Qin leave, he was stunned for a moment and looked suspicious. Soon, he turned his head and whispered a few words to the leading monk in Japanese. The leading monk thought for a moment. He whispered a few words to the monk who could speak Chinese. Soon, the monk who could speak Chinese shouted at Zhou Qin's figure, "Please wait a minute." Zhou Qin turned her face and sneered, "What's wrong?" The monk walked up to Zhou Qin and bowed, saying, "If you are really the guest of Masako Tachibana, please tell me your name." Zhou Qin smiled and turned around. "Go and tell Masako Tachibana that Li Jiandong, whom she wants to see, is here." The monk's face became more and more confused, but he did not dare to be careless. He turned around and whispered a few words to the leading monk, then quickly ran to the Kongabuji temple on the mountain. Zhou Qining stood in the snow. After waiting for about 10 minutes, the monk rushed all the way over. He formed a palm with one hand, bowed respectfully and said, "It turns out to be Jinren Li. Please come in, come in." Zhou Qin saw that they thought of her as Li Jiandong, but she didn't say anything. She smiled and walked inside. After taking a few steps, she came to the entrance of Kongabuji Temple. There were yellow shrines in front of the gates on both sides, and there was a wooden bucket filled with water in the shrine. Zhou Qin walked up the stone steps at the entrance, only to see ancient trees towering into the sky on both sides. The shade of the trees was dense, as if she had entered another world. What surprised her most was that wherever she went, the two sides of the stone steps would automatically light up with a white light, like countless white paper lanterns hanging in the forest. Although it was daytime, Zhou Qin still felt a strong light shrouding her, giving her an inexplicable feeling, as if she was stepping into the temple fairyland. Just as Zhou Qin was about to take a step forward, she suddenly saw Li Jiandong standing not far away and looking at her with a smile, as if he had been waiting for her here for a long time. Zhou Qin was shocked and subconsciously shouted, "Master? Why are you here? When did you get here?" "You." Li Jiandong walked up to Zhou Qin with a gentle smile on his face. He said softly, "I was worried about you, so I followed you." Zhou Qin felt warm in her heart and said with a smile, "I'm fine. I have an official background. They don't dare to do anything to me. But master, you are here now. Aren't you afraid that they will detain you?" Li Jiandong walked up to Zhou Qin, gently took her hand, and said with a smile, "Compared to myself, I am more concerned about your safety." Zhou Qin's heart suddenly started pounding. She couldn't believe that Li Jiandong would say such a thing to her at this time. Although Li Jiandong had shown her warmth and gentleness before, it was more under special circumstances. Although Zhou Qin could keenly sense that Li Jiandong did have a vague affection for her, he always stuck to that line and treated her with courtesy. The scene in front of her was a scene that Zhou Qin had repeatedly dreamed of night after night. It was a scene that she had been thinking about day and night. His arrival was so sudden and so surprising. Zhou Qin looked at Li Jiandong in a daze. Her heart was so happy that it seemed to explode, and her whole body trembled uncontrollably. Li Jiandong seemed to know what Zhou Qin was thinking. He reached out to hold her slender waist and pulled her into his arms. Then, he lowered his head and kissed her fragrant lips. Zhou Qin only felt that her whole body was soft and hot. She subconsciously reached out her hand to block Li Jiandong's mouth and asked in a daze, "What about Su Chan?" However, Li Jiandong smiled slightly and said, "Actually, you are the one I love the most." Zhou Qin's whole body suddenly trembled. Her body, which had been trembling with excitement, gradually calmed down, and the ecstasy in her eyes slowly subsided. She pushed Li Yundong away, and her voice became a little cold. She said slowly, "The Li Yundong I know is the most affectionate and righteous man in the world. He would never say such a thing. Who the hell are you?" Chapter 620. Li Yundong, who was standing in front of Zhou Qin, looked at her in surprise. He took a step forward and reached out to pull her, saying, "I am your master. Don't you recognize me?" Zhou Qin immediately took a step back. Her voice was cold and full of grief and indignation. She shouted, "No, you are not Li Yundong. Who the hell are you?" Li Yundong, who was in front of Zhou Qin, looked more and more surprised. He said in surprise, "Are you crazy? You don't even recognize me?" Zhou Qin had a pair of deep dark eyes. At this time, her eyes were full of tears, and there was a deep sadness in her dark pupils. She smiled bitterly and said, "No, you are not Li Yundong. The real Li Yundong would not talk to me like this. He is a gentleman, and he would never cross the line. You are not him, no matter how well you pretend to be him." Li Yundong, who was standing in front of Zhou Qin, sighed and said, "But isn't this what you dream of? Don't you dream about it every night? Don't you just want to be held gently by me?" Zhou Qin suddenly jumped up and said angrily, "Shut up. Who wants to be held by you? You are not him, you are not Li Yundong. You are just an illusion, my illusion. I am just under an illusion." Li Yundong let out a long sigh and said, "Whether it is an illusion or reality, the most important thing is that you are happy, isn't it? Why do people not want to live in a happy illusory world, but in a painful real world?" Zhou Qin raised her hand, and Qihua instantly appeared in her palm. She smiled bitterly and said, "Of course you won't understand. Why would I want to live in the real world of pain and disappointment?" As she spoke, the chainsaw-toothed Vajra spun rapidly. Its entire body was shrouded in a silver radiance. This radiance became more and more intense, and the speed at which the blazing moon spun also became faster and faster, producing an ear-piercing sound. Zhou Qin pointed at Li Yundong in front of her and said with a sad smile, "Because my master is still waiting for me to go back. I don't want him to worry about me." In an instant, Qihua beside Zhou Qin rushed out like lightning and instantly tore Li Yundong into pieces. The moment Zhou Qin saw Li Yundong being torn to pieces, she felt a sharp pain in her heart, almost piercing through her heart. There was nothing in the world more cruel than what was happening in front of her. After Zhou Qin saw that Li Yundong had been torn into countless pieces by the Qihua, the world around her suddenly shook violently. After a while, she saw that she had suddenly returned to the snowy land where she had gone up the mountain before, and her ears were still echoing with the sound of the bell of the subduing demon Vajra. The monks in front of her were still standing in front of her, maintaining the posture of holding the Vajra pestle in their hands. The copper rings at the top of the Vajra pestle were still colliding with each other. Only then did Zhou Qin understand. It turned out that when the monk in front of her shouted at her, "How dare you be rude to Masako Tachibana?" He paused for a moment, and the monks behind him also paused for a moment. At this moment, they released the illusion magic and made her fall into it. The subduing demon Vajra itself had the Buddhist magic power of breaking the inner demons of stupidity and delusion. In addition, the other party was unprepared, so Zhou Qin fell into the trap at once. Standing in front of Zhou Qin, the anger on the face of the monk, who could speak Chinese, dissipated a little. He shouted, "How dare a guy who is trapped in the sea of love come to Mount Koya to be presumptuous? Let's go. Masako Tachibana won't see people like you." Zhou Qin lowered her head, her body trembling slightly, and she didn't say a word. After a long time, she slowly touched the colorful brocade pouch around her waist. Zhou Qin slowly opened the colorful brocade pouch and took out the Vulcan's whip, Qingwe, and Liuhe one by one. She held the Vulcan's whip in one hand, and the Qingwe was like a crescent moon guarding her left side. The Liuhe was buzzing and guarding her right side. It was divided into two into three, and soon it was divided into 7 Liuhe swords, which were exactly the same as the number of these monks. When the monk saw Zhou Qin's posture, he was shocked, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. He said in surprise, "Are you crazy? How dare you show off your powerful magical weapon in Mount Koya?" Zhou Qin seemed to turn a deaf ear to his words. With tears in her eyes, she said slowly, "I have only loved one person in my life, and this person, although he is my master, although he does not love me, I still love him, respect him, regard him as a god, and respect him as a teacher. If it's possible, if he needs it, I won't hesitate even if I have to sacrifice my life." The Vulcan's whip in Zhou Qin's hand began to burn with a blazing flame from the handle of the whip, which continued to spread to the tip of the whip. She choked and said, "But you forced me to kill the person I love with my own hands. Although it was just an illusion, although it was just a dream, but you forced me to destroy the most beautiful thing in my heart. You forced me to kill my master. You look for him. Die. Really?" Zhou Qin suddenly raised her head, and her eyes were full of crazy anger. Her voice instantly became extremely angry and fierce. She swung the Vulcan's whip in her hand and smashed it heavily toward the monk in front of her. The monk saw that the Vulcan's whip was in front of him in the blink of an eye. It was so ferocious that it seemed to tear space and time apart. It produced a powerful suction force that almost made him unable to move. He took a deep breath and held the devil-subduing Vajra in his hand horizontally. Just as he was about to protect himself, a silver light suddenly flashed in front of him. In an instant, the devil-subduing Vajra in his hand was cut into 3 pieces by the Qiyue, and the 2 ends fell into the snow with a muffled thud. The monk was shocked and subconsciously retreated, but Zhou Qin's Vulcan's whip shook and wrapped around his ankle. Zhou Qin shook her wrist and threw him into the air like a sandbag. Zhou Qin's eyes were full of fire. She gritted her teeth and shouted angrily, "I'll let you use illusion magic." As she said this, the Vulcan's whip in her hand suddenly lashed at the monk, who had been thrown into the air like a storm. Almost at the same time, when the monk's companions saw this scene, they immediately shouted and rushed up together. But as soon as they moved, the Liuhe arrived in an instant and turned into a ball of silver light, enveloping each of them. Without help, the monk who had been thrown into the air by Zhou Qin was instantly set on fire by the Vulcan's whip and turned into a burning fireball. After Zhou Qin slapped the monk fiercely, she threw him to the ground like a rag bag and then went to find trouble with the others. The other monks saw that every part of their companion's skin was unscathed by Zhou Qin. Although the flames all over his body had been extinguished after falling into the snow, he was now covered in smoke and motionless. No one knew whether he was dead or alive. The monk's cultivation was considered top-notch among them, but in the blink of an eye, he had been beaten to death by Zhou Qin. They were so shocked that they retreated one after another. One of the monks shouted in Japanese in panic, "Someone is breaking into the mountain! Someone is breaking into the mountain!" Zhou Qin saw them shouting and scattering like birds and beasts. For a moment, she didn't know which one to chase. She angrily and unwillingly whipped the monk who had fallen to the ground again and spat fiercely. "That's what you get for using illusions." Zhou Qin's whip seemed to have brought the monk back to life again. He immediately let out a miserable howl, which echoed in Mount Koya for a while, arousing a flock of mountain birds. Then, there was a loud bell ringing in Mount Koya. A monk in a bright yellow robe and a bamboo hat stood at the entrance of Mount Koya and shouted in a dignified voice in Japanese, "Who dares to offend Mount Koya? Tell me your name." As soon as he finished speaking, Zhou Qin rushed in front of him like a bolt of lightning and shouted angrily, "A good dog doesn't stand in the way. Get out of my way." After that, the Vulcan's whip smashed the air and blasted in front of his face. The monk was shocked and subconsciously shrank his head. His bamboo hat was immediately blown away by the Vulcan's whip. It burned in midair and instantly turned into ashes. Zhou Qin kicked the monk and sent him flying. She didn't stop at all. She quickly went up the stone steps and rushed toward Mount Koya. Zhou Qin ran all the way up the mountain, but before she could run 200 meters, she saw many monks in monk robes rushing out of the mountain. Some of them were holding six-fingered vajra pestles in their hands. They were pinching their fingers and chanting scriptures, blocking her way like a solid wall. Zhou Qin's eyes swept quickly and she sneered, "A bunch of idiots. Do I have to climb the stairs?" With a flick of the long whip in her hand, she threw it on the trunk of an ancient fir tree. She pulled hard with her hand, and her whole body flew up. In the blink of an eye, she rushed into the jungle. After Zhou Qin left the stone steps of the mountain road, her speed became even faster. Her body was like a spirit monkey. With a few leaps and jumps, she rushed to an extremely tall pagoda in Kongabuji Temple. At a glance, Zhou Qin saw that the red pagoda was 48 meters high and surrounded by 16 pillars. Each pillar was painted with a bodhisattva statue, symbolizing the gods of the esoteric mandala world. Zhou Qin knew that this was the fundamental tower of Kongabuji Temple, one of the core places of Mount Koya. She had already gone deep into the hinterland of Mount Koya. As soon as Zhou Qin landed at the foot of the tower, countless monks came like a tide. These monks roared at Zhou Qin angrily, like a fierce torrent. Although Zhou Qin had entered the primary phase of Jinshin, she did not dare to get entangled with so many people. Moreover, she did not know which of them had yang spirit bodies, and which of them had Jinshin bodies. With a wave of the Vulcan's whip in her hand, Zhou Qin tied a corner of the eaves of the fundamental tower, and pulled herself to the eaves of the top of the tower, looking down at the monks below. Although some of these monks could fly, none of them dared to think that Zhou Qin would be so disrespectful. Therefore, they all pointed at Zhou Qin angrily and scolded her, or quickly chanted incantations and cast magic. At this time, a monk in a purple cassock slowly walked out from under the big tower. The monk's face was full of wrinkles, and he glared at Zhou Qin angrily. He quickly pinched a few fingers and recited a few very short and fast incantations. In an instant, Zhou Qin saw that the bodhisattva statues painted on the fundamental tower had all come to life. One by one, they pounced on her with angry eyes. Chapter 621. Zhou Qin saw that bodhisattvas and arhats quickly appeared on the tower one after another. These bodhisattva statues were surrounded by golden Buddhist power. Each of them was like a god, mighty and unstoppable. Under the tower was a sea of monks from Mount Koya. She was shocked and didn't even have the idea of fighting head-on. A thought flashed through her mind quickly. "I've poked the hornet's nest." Under the tower, a monk in a purple cassock with two gray eyebrows shouted angrily at Zhou Qin in Chinese, "How dare you? Surrender now." However, Zhou Qin was stubborn and unwilling to admit defeat. Zhou Qin gritted her teeth, and the chainsaw vajra will beside her crazily chopped at a statue in front of her. At the same time, the lioha beside her began to split crazily. In the blink of an eye, it split into countless lioha swords. The Bahuang and lioha swords were extremely powerful Taoist magic treasures. The Bahuang sword was best at one-on-one combat. Under the rotating iron lotus throne, it was almost invincible. The mother sword, the lioha sword, was best at one-on-one combat. The more people there were, the more powerful it was. Yan Fang had once held the lioha sword and fought against many people on Mount Gazao alone. She had beaten everyone to a pulp. At that time, she was only at the top level of yang spirit. Now, The Liuha sword was already Li Yundong's personal powerful magical weapon. Li Yundong had also entered the Jinshin phase, so the power of his personal powerful magical weapon had naturally risen. Therefore, although it was lent to Zhou Qin, the Liuha sword was really a little terrifying in front of the vast sea of people. Although Mount Koya was the main mountain of Xinyan Tantrism, with a large number of cultivators and a deep foundation, not every cultivator was a master. There were even many monks among them who had not even reached the Zhuji phase. However, these monks who had not reached the Zhuji phase had to face the Liuha sword, which was equivalent to the Jinshin phase. When the flying sword fell, they immediately cried for their parents. Zhou Qin saw that the Liuha sword was divided, and there were immediately saber lights and sword shadows everywhere on the field. The bottom of the tower seemed to have become a sea of swords in an instant. Almost every monk was fighting with the Liuha sword. Although some of the monks were so strong that they could definitely defeat the Liuha in a one-on-one fight, because many monks were not strong enough, they had to divide their energy to protect them. Therefore, the two sides were in a deadlock. For a time, the field became a mess of thin porridge, and it was a mess. When the monk in the purple kasaya saw this scene, he was so angry that he blew his beard and glared at them. He shouted in Japanese, "Get into formation!" When these monks with lower cultivation heard his shout, they quickly gathered together. Some were sitting, some were standing, and some were pinching their fingers as they chanted scriptures loudly. In an instant, a glittering magic array appeared around them. The magic array was surrounded by glittering Sanskrit characters, and the chanting of the monks shook the heavens and the earth, bringing with it a huge pressure like a landslide or tsunami. Each of these monks was relatively weak, but when they gathered together, it was as if countless small water droplets had gathered into mountains, rivers, and seas, forming an extremely powerful force. Even the Liuha dared not move forward while surrounding them. In the cultivation world, no matter which sect cultivators were from, they basically had a common understanding that magic was easy to learn, but magic treasures were hard to find. Magic treasures were easy to find, but magic arrays were hard to find. The various magic arts of various sects represented the most basic power of the cultivation world, and were the most fundamental embodiment of the difference between cultivators and mortals. A cultivator who did not know magic arts was embarrassed to say that he was a cultivator. Otherwise, what was the difference between him and ordinary people? Above magic arts, there were magic treasures. These magic treasures were all refined by cultivators, with a lot of manpower and material resources. Compared with magic arts, magic treasures had the ability to fight alone, so their status in the cultivation world was above magic arts. Because of this, magic treasures were the things that every cultivator dreamed of the most. Even a powerful magic treasure could make an ordinary cultivator become a famous figure in the world. However, magic treasures were not omnipotent. When there was a dominant sect in the cultivation world, this cultivation sect would collect a large number of magic treasures and monopolize them. In order to fight against this situation, some smaller sects would turn to research the development of magic matrices. The most powerful thing about magic arrays was that they could gather everyone's strength together and exert the power of 1 + 1 was greater than 2. In the face of some exquisite and powerful magic arrays, even Jingxian masters did not dare to take the risk personally. At this time, Zhou Qin was entangled with the Arhat Bodhisattva of the fundamental tower, with the Vulcan's whip and the Qingwe, while constantly observing the situation on the field. After she saw that these monks had formed a strange magic array, the Liuha only dared to do some small-scale harassment and testing around, not daring to attack on a large scale. At this time, the powerful monks also freed up their hands and launched a fierce counterattack against the Liuha in front of them. Even the monk in purple grabbed the Liuha with one hand. He quickly bit his wrist, held a mouthful of blood, and was about to spit it at the Liuha. The Liuha had been broken by Li Yunyang twice in a row with the boy's Yuanyang blood. It was originally a psychic magic treasure, so how could it be hit a third time? In the blink of an eye, the Liuha flying all over the sky disappeared in an instant and turned into a sword. It quickly returned to Zhou Qin's side and floated in the air, making waves of unreconciled buzzing sounds. It seemed to be frightened by the old monk in the purple cassock, and did not dare to attack again for a while. Seeing this, Zhou Qin became more and more frightened. She did not dare to fight anymore. At the moment when the Chiwa split the Bodhisattva statue in front of her, she shook her wrist, and the Vulcan's whip hit the trunk of the nearest ancient tree. She kicked her feet, and quickly fled into the depths of the forest. When the monks under the pagoda saw Zhou Qin escaping, they all shouted and chased after her again. Unexpectedly at this time, the Liuha suddenly turned around and split into countless Liuha swords in an instant. They stared at these monks covetously and eagerly. When the monks saw this, they were shocked. They immediately stopped in their tracks and quickly formed a formation to recite their scriptures. However, the Liuha sword made a feint. After frightening these monks, it immediately turned into a sword and chased after Zhou Qin like lightning into the depths of the mountain. The monk in the purple cassock was furious and shouted, "Monks below the great monk capital, form a formation to protect themselves. The others follow me." The monks of Xinyan Tantrism were divided into 16 levels, namely teacher, lawyer, junior monk capital, little monk capital, middle monk capital, great monk capital, little monk capital, middle monk capital, great monk capital, little monk capital, middle monk capital, great monk capital, and great monk capital. There was more than one great monk of Xinyan Tantrism, so there was a supreme level above the great monk capital, which was the Dharma seal. Historically, if the great monk of Xinyan Tantrism wanted to inherit the position of Dharma seal, he must have amazing magical power and supreme virtue to be qualified to inherit. Among them, the teacher's trial was the lowest level, which was equivalent to the primary level of the first level of the 9 heavens of the Chinese cultivation world, molding body. The great monk capital mentioned by the monk in the purple cassock corresponded to the top level of the yang spirit realm in the 9 heavens of the Chinese cultivation world. After these monks below the top level of the yang spirit realm stayed in place to protect themselves, although the number of people chasing them had been reduced by more than half, the combat effectiveness of these monks had increased by more than one level. Zhou Qin saw that these monks were chasing after her. Almost every one of them was holding an 8-finger-long vajra pestle in their hands. Each of them was strong and their eyes were like knives and swords. Just by looking at their faces, she knew that they were not to be trifled with. For a moment, she gritted her teeth in her heart. When there was no way out, she saw a relatively dark path in front of her. At the entrance of the path were 2 stone shrines full of classical Japanese characteristics. On both sides of the shrines, there were black banners with white characters. Zhou Qin had no time to look at them, so she rushed in. As soon as the monks chasing after her saw her rush in, they immediately stopped and turned to look at the monk in the purple cassock. When the monk in the purple cassock saw Zhou Qin rush into the Okanoin of Mount Koya, he immediately sneered and said, "What a reckless guy. We'll wait for her here. If she comes out, we'll catch her. If she goes inside, then she's already a dead person." Zhou Qin was in a panic and rushed into the Okanoin, the core hinterland of Mount Koya. At first, she didn't pay attention, but as she walked, she found that the light around her was getting dimmer and dimmer. Looking around, she saw that there were towering trees everywhere, and almost every one of them was a 1,000-year-old ancient fir tree that could only be embraced by several people. These ancient fir trees covered the place called Ragoino, which was respected by the Japanese cultivation world. The deeper they went, the less light could come in, as if this place had become another world isolated from the world. These ancient fir trees alone had already made this place feel gloomy and cold. But what made Zhou Qin feel even more creepy was that there were all kinds of tombstones on both sides of the stone steps. Each tombstone was engraved with a person's name, and almost all of them were in traditional Chinese characters. At a glance, Zhou Qin saw that there were some famous big shots: Oda Nobunaga, Takeda Shingen, Tokugawa Ieyasu, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and so on. When Zhou Qin saw this, she immediately complained in her heart, "Damn it, why did I come here? Because she had seen the magic of Tachibana Wakako at the Taoist assembly, Zhou Qin had also read a lot of materials after going back, and had a certain understanding of Xinyan Tantrism. When she saw this scene, she knew that she had gone to Regoino in a panic. It could be said that Mount Koya was especially divided into Mount Koya and Regoino. Outside Mount Koya were ordinary monks. Basically, the one with the highest cultivation was the young monk, who was qualified to wear a purple cassock. However, Regoino was a place where eminent monks practiced hard. Only the strongest monks were qualified to enter. At this time, Zhou Qin saw that the surroundings were full of yin qi. The light was so dim that she could hardly see her fingers. There were tombstones everywhere on both sides of the stone steps. It was as if she had entered a world of death, and the air was extremely cold. Although there was no one here, Zhou Qin felt that there was a pair of eyes staring at her from every tombstone, which made her feel a chill in her heart. At this time, if it were anyone else, they might immediately turn around and leave this horrible and gloomy place. There were 100,000 tombstones in Regoino that had been worshipped here for thousands of years. How could the yin qi gathered here be a joke? However, Zhou Qin was a stubborn person. She would never turn back until she hit the wall. She made up her mind, gritted her teeth, and walked inside. Along the way, the more Zhou Qin walked inside, the more spacious and gloomier she saw. After walking along the stone steps for hundreds of meters, Zhou Qin found that there was a Japanese-style hut on a relatively open land. The hut was black, and the eaves were arched. The roof was covered with black tiles. In front of the hut, there were 2 stone shrines. The shrines were dedicated to 2 gods, namely the immovable Wisdom King and the Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva. Not far from the door of this hut, there was an ancient well. A woman in a kimono and wooden clogs was standing in front of the ancient well, slowly fetching water. When Zhou Qin saw this woman, she was stunned. Who is this? Why is she here? Is she Masako Tachibana? Well, blue revolving shoes, you're amazing. You've been on the VIP list in one day. You're really good. Chapter 622. Zhou Qin looked at the woman with great vigilance, only to see that she was shaking a wooden wheel. The wooden wheel squeaked as it turned. As the wheel turned, a wooden barrel was pulled up little by little. But to Zhou Qin's surprise, there was no rope on the wooden wheel. But every time the woman turned the wooden wheel, the barrel in the ancient well would rise a little, as if there was an invisible rope hanging it. After the woman lifted a bucket of water, she turned around and walked back to the room behind her. However, there were 5 holes in the wooden barrel she was carrying. Along the way, almost all the water had leaked out. When she walked to a huge water tank on the side of the hut, the water in the bucket was almost completely leaked. She stood on her tiptoes, lifted the bucket, and poured it into the huge water tank. But only a few drops of water were poured in. However, the woman didn't notice it at all. After pouring the water, she immediately carried the bucket back to the side of the ancient well, and then slowly began to draw water again. But what surprised Zhou Qin the most was that the soil under the water tank was wet. It was obvious that the water tank itself was also leaking. Seeing her repeating this action mechanically, Zhou Qin felt strange in her heart. She couldn't help thinking to herself, this water tank is as big as a person, and it's so thick that it would take several adult men to wrap their arms around it. But this woman can only draw a few drops of water at a time. Besides, the water tank itself is leaking. Even if a full bucket is poured in, it will leak clean. If I draw water like this, I'm afraid that I won't be able to fill the tank until the end of time. Zhou Qin watched quietly from the side for a long time. The woman seemed to not notice her existence, and kept repeating this action. When Zhou Qin saw the woman repeat this action for the 50th time, she couldn't help but say, "Why don't you fix the water tank and the wooden barrel with 5 holes before you draw water?" When the woman heard Zhou Qin's words, she smiled slightly, turned her face, and looked at Zhou Qin with interest. She asked in very standard Chinese, "Why don't you get rid of all the hostility in your body and talk to me again?" Zhou Qin saw that the woman looked to be in her 30s, and her skin was smooth and snow-white. She frowned secretly and said, "How could I have hostility all over my body?" The woman smiled faintly and also fell down. "My wooden barrel is also intact." As she spoke, she slowly picked up another bucket of water. This wooden bucket was still leaking heavily. As she walked, the water leaked out completely. Zhou Qin pointed to the water stain under her feet and said, "Look, is it leaking?" The woman also pointed in the direction of Zhou Qin and said with a smile, "Look, aren't you full of hostility?" Zhou Qin was surprised and said unhappily, "I'm kind enough to remind you, but you're playing tricks with me. Do you think I don't understand what you're saying? If the monks at the foot of the mountain hadn't offended me first, why would I be so angry?" The woman smiled and said, "You're right. Everything has a cause and effect. But have you ever thought about why I'm constantly fetching water here?" Zhou Qin frowned and asked, "Did you make a mistake and get punished?" The woman smiled and said, "That's right. I made a big mistake, so I'm punished to use this bucket of 5 leeks to fetch water until the water jar is full." Zhou Qin said with some sympathy, "Ah, I thought you were Masako Tachibana, but I didn't expect that you weren't. Were you punished by Masako Tachibana to fetch water here?" The woman laughed and said, "Yes, you're so smart. You guessed it right." Zhou Qin saw that the woman was kind and polite. Although she was not very beautiful, her face was gentle, and there was a different kind of tranquility in her movements. The resentment in her heart gradually dissipated a lot. Zhou Qin said, "You are also very smart. At a glance, you know that I was chased up the mountain. Why didn't you catch me?" The woman smiled and shook her head. "I'm not interested in your business, but the hostility in you is obvious. Look, the souls here are all looking at you." As she said this, she pointed around. Zhou Qin looked around and saw that the tombstones were standing silently like a forest. There was no sign of a ghost. However, there was an incomparably huge pressure in this silent silence, which made her hair stand on end. Zhou Qin shivered secretly and asked, "I was forced to." "Forget it, let's not talk about this. I want to ask you, do you know where Masako Tachibana is? I want to see her." The woman stopped fetching water and looked at Zhou Qin carefully with interest. She asked, "What do you want to see her for?" Zhou Qin said, "She sent a letter to my master a while ago. Now I'm sending a letter back." The woman laughed and said, "I see. I understand." She pointed to a deep and hidden path behind her and said, "Go from here and walk another 200 meters inside. You will see a wooden house. That's it. Masako Tachibana is there." Zhou Qin formed a palm with one hand and thanked her with Taoist etiquette. Then she walked all the way inside. Not long after she left, a little girl came out of the house. The girl was about 13 or 14 years old, with red lips and white teeth. She was very beautiful. It was Tachibana Wakako, who had participated in the Taoist assembly and been beaten to tears by Li Jiandong. Tachibana Wakako stepped on wooden clogs and ran to the woman with small steps. She asked curiously, "Grandma, why didn't you show her the wrong way? Why did you tell her where her mother lives?" Tachibana Wakako's grandmother lowered her head and smiled slightly. "Silly child, she has already gone the wrong way. But how can we let her go the wrong way again?" Tachibana Wakako blinked her eyes as if she understood. "But she is our enemy." Tachibana Wakako's grandmother laughed and said, "There are no eternal enemies, and there are no eternal friends. Tachibana Wakako, you have to remember this sentence." Tachibana Wakako pouted unhappily and said, "I don't want to be friends with them. They caused my mother to be scolded so badly by many people, and I was scolded so badly by my mother. I hate them so much." Tachibana Wakako's grandmother shook her head helplessly and said with a smile, "More than 10 years ago, I was very good friends with the masters of these people. Alas, I didn't expect it to become like this now. I really didn't expect it." Tachibana Wakako's eyes widened and she asked curiously, "Really, Grandma? I've never heard you say that. Who are these people that you are talking about? Are you referring to that hateful Li Jiandong?" Tachibana Wakako's grandmother stopped moving and raised her head, as if she was recalling something. She said slowly, "I'm talking about Li Jiandong's friend. That little girl named Ziyuan, She has a very great master called Wang Yuanshan. When Tachibana Wakako heard this, she became interested. She supported herself with her hands and sat on the edge of the ancient well. Her legs, which were wearing white horizontal cotton socks, were kicking. She asked with a smile, "Grandma, is this Wang Yuanshan your lover?" Tachibana Wakako's grandmother couldn't help laughing. She looked at Tachibana Wakako reproachfully and said, "You are not allowed to be disrespectful to him." She didn't continue the topic of Tachibana Wakako, but let out a long sigh and said, "When I went to Shiyuan Temple in Dongwu City, China, to worship the statue of Master Hongfa, I met him by accident. At that time." As Tachibana Wakako's grandmother spoke, she seemed to recall the scene of that year, and she couldn't help showing a gentle expression on her face. She said softly, "At that time, he followed me all the way out of Shiyuan Temple and followed me for a long time. At that time, I thought he was a lecher and wanted to drive him away. Unexpectedly, he suddenly told me that although the magic power all over my body looked powerful, it was actually vulnerable. At that time, I was proud and arrogant, so I was unwilling to believe him, so I asked him to a place to fight in private." Tachibana Wakako covered her mouth and exclaimed, "Grandma, did you lose?" Tachibana Wakako's grandmother laughed and said, "Yes, I lost miserably. It's really a memory that I can't bear to look back on." Tachibana Wakako suddenly remembered that before she had fought with Li Yundong, she had been really powerful and invincible. But when she had fought with Li Yundong, she had been slapped by his palm. She was so scared that she had lost any reaction and burst into tears. Tachibana Wakako suddenly became unhappy and said, "Yes, the last time I fought with Li Yundong, I also lost miserably. I even cried. It's shameful to think about it." Tachibana Wakako's grandmother laughed, touched Tachibana Wakako's black hair, and said with a smile, "In fact, when time slowly passes, when everything slowly settles down, you will find that these are actually nothing. They will all become your precious wealth." However, Tachibana Wakako said disapprovingly, "But I feel that I wish all of this had never happened. I don't even dare to see my mother now. I hide from her everywhere." Tachibana Wakako's grandmother smiled slightly and said, "So that's how it is. I was wondering why you hid here all day long to accompany me, an old woman." Tachibana Wakako giggled. She rolled her eyes, took her hand, and quickly changed the topic. "Nonsense, my grandmother is not an old woman. She is young and beautiful. By the way, Grandma, what happened after you lost to Wang Yuanshan? Did you fall in love with him at first sight?" The eyes of Tachibana Wakako's grandmother suddenly became extremely soft. She didn't comment and said softly, "After I lost, I was convinced and wanted to take him as my teacher, but he insisted on not doing so. But when I asked him why he lost, he refused to tell me. So I kept pestering him and followed him for more than 2 months." As she spoke, she fell into that period of memories for a moment. The smile on her face became more and more gentle and sweet. After a long time she said, "It's a pity that he refused to accept me. Maybe it's because I'm the goddess of Ergoino. But in the end, when I left, he handed me this barrel and said to me, 'When you use this barrel to fill a huge and leaky water tank, you will understand why you lost to me.'" Tachibana Wakako let out an ah and suddenly said, "So that's how it is. Grandma, why have you been fetching water here for more than 10 years? But this barrel and tank are both leaky, so it's impossible to fill them up." Tachibana Wakako's grandmother sighed and said, "Yes, for the past 10 years, I've been using this bucket to fetch water, but I've never been able to fill the water tank. Not to mention filling it up. I can't even fill half of it." "Alas." Tachibana Wakako pouted and said, "Grandma, I think Wang Yuanshan is playing tricks on you. This is simply impossible." As she spoke, she jumped down from the edge of the well, picked up the barrel in her hand, held it in front of her eyes and said, "Grandma, look, if it wasn't for that sister, I wouldn't have paid attention to this barrel. There are so many holes in it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. While there are 5 holes, there are also holes on the side. And the most important thing is that there are also 2 holes at the bottom. If you use this kind of wooden barrel to fetch water, of course, you can't get water." Tachibana Wakako said with a serious face. Although I don't like that sister just now, she is right. Why don't you mend the 5 leaky bucket and the water tank? This sentence is very reasonable. Tachibana Wakako's grandmother smiled and said, Where is the reason? Well, this morning, I saw on Weibo that there were children waiting for an update. I waited until after 5 o'clock. I was really ashamed. Although there were a lot of things to do, and I was unable to explode, I felt that it was not good to let the readers wait for the update. I, Tang, sincerely apologize to all my readers, and to the reader who waited until 5:30 a.m. to be bitten by a mosquito. In the future, I will try my best to update a chapter in the morning or at noon and advance the update time. Even if there is a change, I will definitely tell the readers in advance in the previous chapter. This is my fault. I apologize again. There will be another update in a while, and the change will start from today. Chapter 623. Tachibana Wakako said innocently, Mend the bucket and the water tank, and you can quickly fill the tank with water, and then you can go out. Isn't it uncomfortable to stay in this place all day? You've been here for more than 10 years. Tachibana Masako's grandmother laughed and said, It's been more than 10 years. Do you still care about this? Lord Yuanshan asked me to fetch water. He must be testing my willpower and endurance. He must think that my endurance and willpower and cultivation are not enough, so I will lose to him. Tachibana Wakako said angrily, Nonsense. He must be playing tricks on you. How can there be such a test of willpower and endurance? There are 5 more holes in a wooden barrel. No matter how powerful he is, he can't fill a water tank. Tachibana Wakako's grandmother had been a goddess with a very high cultivation in Junyan Tantrism. Her status was extremely high, and she was highly respected. But because she had secretly lost to Wang Yuanshan more than 10 years ago, she had returned to the deep mountains of Ergoino with a leaky wooden barrel and began to fetch water non-stop. Out of awe of her, others did not dare to ask, nor did they dare to say anything more. As the saying goes, the onlooker sees the game clearly. Tachibana Wakako's grandmother had been trapped in the mystery given to her by Wang Yuanshan for more than 10 years, and she had never jumped out to see this problem. At this time, Zhou Qin and Tachibana Wakako repeatedly asked this question at the same time. Tachibana Wakako's grandmother finally had an idea. She had subconsciously repeated the word 5-leak bucket with Zhou Qin's words, but she didn't pay attention at that time. At this time, she was stunned for a moment and murmured, 5 leaks? Why are there only 5 loopholes? She took the wooden barrel from Tachibana Wakako's hand and looked at it carefully. The more she looked at it, the more her eyes shone. Her voice gradually became excited and she said in a low voice, Yes, didn't Buddha say that men have 7 treasures and women have 5 leaks? Do the 5 loopholes in this wooden barrel refer to the 5 loopholes in my body? Tachibana Wakako's grandmother was also a great cultivator. Although she was the goddess of Junyan Tantrism, she had read the cultivation classics of various sects and schools since she was a child. She was very knowledgeable, but she got into a dead end for a while and couldn't turn around. At this time, she was inadvertently pointed out by someone, and she immediately pushed away the clouds and saw the bright moon. Buddhist cultivation was completely different from Taoist cultivation. In the beginning, Taoist cultivation was just like Buddhism. It only focused on cultivating one's life, which was to cultivate one's own spiritual world. It didn't pay attention to cultivating one's nature, which was to cultivate one's physical body. However, ever since Zhang Buoduan advocated dual cultivation of life and body, in the Northern Song dynasty, almost all the Taoist sects accepted his view and began to cultivate their spirit and body at the same time. In the past, Zhang Buoduan had made an appointment with a monk to travel around Yangzhou in the form of Yang spirit. After returning, the monk talked about the blooming of Qionghua in Yangzhou, but Zhang Buoduan smiled and did not say anything. He took out a Qionghua from his sleeve. The monk was shocked. His Yang spirit could not touch things, but Zhang Buoduan's Yang spirit could, so he broke a Qionghua and came back. The monk asked him why. Zhang Buoduan said, You cultivate your life but not your nature, and I just cultivate my life and body. It was also for this reason that after the Northern Song dynasty, more and more Buddhist sects began to cultivate their life and body, but their cultivation methods and ideas were different. The magic and cultivation ideas of Zhenyan Tantrism were passed down from the Tantrism of the Tang dynasty, so they also paid attention to cultivating life, rather than nature. Moreover, for thousands of years, the ancient meaning school of Zhenyan Tantrism had been entrenched in Mount Koya, and had been fighting with the new meaning school. Although they were powerful, in order to emphasize the difference between their cultivation ideas and that of the new meaning school, they had always been self-restrained. In addition, the hierarchy in Japan was obvious, and the relationship between superiors and subordinates was extremely strict. All kinds of rules and systems were like steel and concrete blockhouses that were indestructible, and almost no one could shake them. This situation had led to the steady development of the Japanese cultivation world. It had a deep foundation and great power, but it also made it impossible for them to be like the Chinese cultivation world. Amazing talents emerged one after another, and there were hidden dragons and crouching tigers everywhere in the land of China. Tachibana Wakako's grandmother accidentally figured out this forbidden area of doubt that no one had tried to touch for thousands of years. She was ecstatic and said to herself, "Yes, it must be so. Only the Taoist cultivation sects in the world pay attention to repairing the 5 leakage body. He must have seen that I didn't repair the 5 leakage body, so he used this to warn me. This wooden barrel is referring to my 5 apertures body, and this large water jar is referring to my cultivation. Although the water tank is huge, due to the defects of the 5 leakage body, it can't be filled with water. No matter how much water I get, it will leak clean." Yes, that must be what Lord Yuanshan meant. Alas, when I saw this girl's hostility, I wanted to enlighten her according to her wishes, but I didn't expect that I would be enlightened by her instead. It's ridiculous, ridiculous. Tachibana Wakako's grandmother finally couldn't help but raise her head and laugh. "I understand, Lord Yuanshan. So that's what you mean. I understand." She burst into laughter. Her voice penetrated the dark and gloomy Ragoino and rushed straight into the sky, shaking Mount Koya so that her laughter echoed everywhere. The mountains shook and thousands of birds came out of the forest. Zhou Qin didn't know that her inadvertent words had actually enlightened a goddess of Zhenyan Tantrism, who had been cultivating in seclusion. She didn't know what would happen after she enlightened Tachibana Wakako's grandmother. Zhou Qin walked all the way in the direction pointed by Tachibana Wakako's grandmother. Sure enough, after walking for 200 meters, she saw a black tile and white wall in front of her. Inside the wall was a maple tree. Although it was in the cold season between spring and winter, this maple tree had a fiery red leaf. Although it was beautiful compared with the withering scene around it, it revealed a strange feeling. Zhou Qin glanced at the maple tree and walked along the stone road to the gate of the yard. After pushing the door open and entering, she saw a large wooden house in front of her, full of the style of Japanese architecture. There was no tombstone beside the wooden house, and bright red maple leaves were scattered on the ground, giving off a sense of tranquility and gloominess. Zhou Qin knew that she had entered the heart of Ragoino Okuhara, where the goddess, Masako Tachibana, lived. Although she had always been bold and calm, at this time, her heart couldn't help beating violently. At this moment, a leisurely woman's voice came from the wooden house, also in very standard Chinese. "Just now you were extremely bold. Why are you as timid as a mouse now?" Zhou Qin's heart trembled. She took a deep breath and quickly adjusted her mind. After stabilizing her emotions, she was neither humble nor arrogant, and walked inside unhurriedly. After walking up a few wooden stairs, she came to the door and saw a woman in a white witch costume with a red belt around her waist kneeling on the tatami, elegantly making tea. Next to her sat an old monk in a red and white cassock. The old monk had a solemn face and was holding a string of prayer beads in his hand. He was looking at his nose and his nose at his heart, chanting scriptures in a low voice. It seemed that he had turned a deaf ear to Zhou Qin's arrival. In front of the tatami, Zhou Qin was about to step forward. "Masako Tachibana, who was wearing a white witch costume, did not raise her head and said slowly, "Please take off your shoes and come in." Zhou Qin saw that Masako Tachibana's appearance was almost the same as that of Tachibana Wakako. She was very beautiful. When she was making tea, her every move was worthy of the word elegant. Her whole body was flowing with elegant and artistic aura. At this moment, she seemed to be more like an elegant and beautiful tea lady than a famous goddess. When beauties met each other, there would always be sparks and waves in the dark, especially when the two beauties were hostile to each other. Zhou Qin saw that although Masako Tachibana was elegant and dignified, her tone of voice revealed a condescending aura, which made her feel very uncomfortable, and her heart was full of knots. Zhou Qin frowned secretly. She didn't want to give in according to Masako Tachibana's words, so she stood at the door and said, "I just came to deliver a letter, and I don't need to go in." At this time, Masako Tachibana raised her head and looked at Zhou Qin leisurely. She smiled slightly and said, "Oh, show me the letter." Zhou Qin also smiled slightly. She raised her hand and threw the letter in her hand at Masako Tachibana. The letter was controlled by her Jinchi to fly in the air and quickly flew toward Masako Tachibana's face. Masako Tachibana raised her hand, and the letter stopped in front of her. She smiled and said, "Is this how you send letters? Is this your etiquette?" Zhou Qin also smiled and said, "This is how you sent letters at the beginning, so I will return it to you like this." Masako Tachibana frowned slightly and did not continue to pester Zhou Qin. She picked up the envelope and saw that it was the simplest ordinary envelope. There was no word on it, and it was not even sealed. It was not solemn at all. She could not help but frown deeper. When she opened the letter inside and glanced at it, she saw 6 murderous cursive characters leaping out of it. The murderous aura contained in these 6 characters was aggressive, like a longbow that was ready to be shot, like a sharp sword that would be unsheathed at any time. Even the red-robed monk beside him couldn't help opening his eyes slightly and glancing at the letter. But he just glanced at it, and soon closed his eyes again. Masako Tachibana looked at the reply in front of her meaningfully and laughed. There was anger in her laughter. Good words, good momentum. He is indeed a master who defeated Tachibana Wakako. I really want to meet him right away. As she said this, she raised her head and said to Zhou Qin, "Who are you to him?" Zhou Qin said, "I'm his disciple." Masako Tachibana nodded and said, "I see." After that, she continued to make tea leisurely, leaving Zhou Qin aside. Seeing that she didn't respond, Zhou Qin originally had a stomach full of words to say, but at this time, there was no place to vent them. She held her breath in her heart and said unhappily, "Since there's nothing else, I'll go back first." At this time, Masako Tachibana raised her head and looked at Zhou Qin in surprise. She said, "Are you leaving?" At this time, Zhou Qin had already turned around and was about to leave. Hearing this, she also turned around and asked, "Why don't you leave?" Masako Tachibana stared at Zhou Qin as if she were looking at an idiot. She said in surprise, "You injured the monks of our Mount Koya, made a scene in Mount Koya, and broke into the Okwen without permission. How dare you want to leave? What do you think Mount Koya is?" Zhou Qin's heart tightened, and her voice slowly became cold. She said in a deep voice, "Do you want to detain me?" Masako Tachibana said lightly, "You have to give us an explanation. Otherwise, if the matter gets out, what will others think of our Mount Koya?" Zhou Qin sneered and said, "It's you who are disrespectful and rude." Masako Tachibana also said coldly, "Then can you do such a cruel thing?" Zhou Qin raised her eyebrows and was furious in her heart. "What about the illusion that you forced me to kill my master?" But at this time, Zhou Qin had calmed down. She knew that it was useless for her to say such words, so she swallowed them back. She sneered and said, "If you want to detain me, it depends on whether you have the ability or not." Hearing her words, Masako Tachibana immediately burst out laughing. Her voice was full of disdain and sarcasm, as if she was mocking Zhou Qin for overestimating herself. Zhou Qin was proud and arrogant. How could she stand such ridicule? Her eyebrows were getting higher and higher. and her hand slowly touched the Vulcan's whip around her waist. However, Masako Tachibana seemed to not notice her movements. She still laughed unscrupulously and left the door wide open. Seeing that she was so arrogant, Zhou Qin was even more angry. After holding the handle of the Vulcan's whip in her hand, she was about to exert her strength when she suddenly heard a hurried shout from behind. "Stop, don't hit me. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."